Chapter 891. The night was as cold as water, but Santos was sweating from the heat. Ever since he was captured, he had been locked in a hollow, iron statue. Because of the magic runes carved to imprison him, he did not need to eat, drink, or defecate as long as someone replaced the charged obsidian magic orbs in time. Santos had been observing the place for a long time through the eyes of the iron statue, which were the air holes. He saw a charcoal fire burning in a furnace, which someone was blowing fiercely with a pair of fans. A piece of iron was firmly embedded in the trunk of a large tree growing in the house, forming a waist-high anvil. A man was bent over, using a hammer and a narrow chisel to hammer away pieces of what looked like gold. There was a lamp on the anvil, which, together with the fire, provided illumination for the craftsman's work. There was also a large water tank next to it, which was no doubt used to cool the hot metal. A pair of scissors, also used to cut the metal, was also hanging on a thick wooden nail nailed to the old tree. Santos had already guessed that this was a jewelry workshop. There was also a shelf in the shop, which was full of neatly arranged tools, awls, pliers, heavy-edge trimming scissors, and some cutting tools with small blades and long handles. The owner of the shop was a well-built merchant in his 30s, with a round double chin. He seemed to be of Japanese ancestry. However, the man did not appear in the workshop often. He should be busy in the front shop, where there were usually only 2 workers. It wasn't that Santos hadn't thought of saving himself. He had tried many methods, but none of them worked. Not only could this iron prison statue suppress his warlock's ability to cast spells, but because of the narrow space inside, he couldn't use his strength. Therefore, there was no way for him to use brute force to break free. Originally, he had hoped to shout at the 2 workers through the air hole, or threaten or promise to force them to help him open the iron statue. However, after trying a few times, he realized that the ventilation hole really only had the function of letting in air. Even if he shouted himself hoarse, the 2 workers working in the workshop could not hear him. From the conversation between the 2 men, Santos learned that the owner of the jewelry store had told them that the iron prisoner statue was a kind of ritual object from Japan that had been worshipped by his ancestors for generations. Although it was not worth much to make of pig iron, it was said that it could bless the craftsmen with some luck when they worked. Therefore, when the 2 workers came to work, they would take the initiative to help the owner change the obsidian magic beads on the iron statue. Moreover, the work in the jewelry shop seemed to be busy these 2 days. The 2 workers worked overtime all day and did not even leave the workshop to eat or sleep. When is this going to end? Santos thought helplessly. Let me out to fight with that horrible demon. Even if I can't defeat him, it's much better than being trapped in an iron coffin and waiting to die. I don't know if the masters in the Chamber of Commerce are done with their work. Hurry and save me. What he did not know was that while he was crying in his heart, 2 distinguished guests came to the jewelry shop in front of the workshop. I wish you happiness and good health, Lady Shanka. The jewelry merchant, whom Santos had met a few times before, was waiting at the door of the shop with the signboard "A Treasure House." He first greeted Shanka, his own master, and then Edgar, the acting governor of Spat City. I wish you a long and prosperous life, Lady Edgar. He greeted the owner of the jewelry shop in both Japanese and Medici ways. It was obvious that the jewelry shop owner was very good at communicating with people. After the greeting, he immediately helped the guest open the shop's storm door and led him into the treasure pavilion that had been cleaned long ago. The shop was full of all kinds of jewelry. Although most of them were just for show, the real valuable jewelry would not be displayed in public. They still made the shop look luxurious. Business is good. Edgar looked at the money box hanging from the roof beam and exclaimed in admiration. The safe box containing silver Kate and a small amount of gold Drogo gongs was about to land on the counter, which meant that the iron ingot on the other side of the lever was about to leave the ground. Shops in Spat City usually had such a cashier device. Whenever the money box landed on the counter, the shop owner would quickly deposit it into the bank opened by the scale of perpetual order in exchange for a magic contract that allowed him to withdraw the money at any time. This way, he would not have to store a large amount of money in the shop or home, which would attract the attention of thieves. Thanks to you 2, it's really good, the shop owner said. Seeing that Edgar just smiled and did not say anything, Shanka waved her hand and said, "Take the money box down and exchange the silver kate in it for gold drogo gongs. After today's delivery, we still have to make a batch of gold pendants. I'm afraid that the gold shavings you've accumulated from making jewelry can't make up for the shortage of raw materials in a short time. The other products in the territory of the Megalosaurus pasha aside, the gold reserves alone are really rare in the world. Let's melt the gold drogo gongs and use them directly." Hearing this, the jewelry shop owner cupped his hands and immediately did as he was told. It was now evening, and there were no other customers in the shop. Shanka and Edgar sat in the shop and waited. They would go out of the city with the shop owner to the ferry port in Narohi to deliver the goods. It was precisely because there were too many gold products being traded that the boss informed Shanka in advance and asked Edgar to bring some guards with him in case of any accidents. "The one who wants this batch of gold is," Edgar said, dipping his finger in the apple wine in the corner cup in front of him and writing the word Khedive on the table. "Yes, not only my house, but almost half of the jewelry shops in Spat are rushing to make gold products." Shanka nodded and did not intend to hide it. "I don't know why those lords want a large batch of gold recently, and they need to refine it. It's too eye-catching to exchange silver kate for gold drogo gongs directly from the bank in the city, so they order from various jewelry shops. They buy it with silver kate. Don't they want to dump their goods in Spat? Why do they want to get gold from here first?" Edgar was a little puzzled. This time, Shanka did not answer him, even though she had more or less guessed the reason. Of course, it was impossible for the original Japanese noblewoman to know so clearly, but the leader of the Night Hag army who swallowed her and transformed into her appearance was different. Shanka knew that the Khedive of the Medici Empire had been fighting with some underground races. She also knew that if the Drows wanted to use their equipment and weapons under the sun, they had to use a special alchemy potion mixed with gold to refine them. Shanka guessed that the reason why the Khedive wanted to get gold first was probably to use the gold to trade with the Drows, and then get some of the special goods produced by the Drows. Probably just a few things. Shanka knew what the Drows were. Most of the Khedive's business is about eating and drinking. Tobacco, alcohol, salt, sugar, candles, and condiments from the Drows. I'm afraid it'll stir up a storm in Spat. They're really up to something. Although she thought about it, Shanka had no intention of telling Edgar about it. Even if her nominal husband intervened in this matter, he would probably, no, definitely not end well. She would not tell him about it. After all, she was a hag, and a hag would not have any good intentions. On the contrary, if she facilitated this matter, there would be problems in the territory of the Megalosaurus pasha, and the scale of perpetual order would be busy solving the problem. Then she could safely return to the gray wasteland and build her tower of pain manifestation. I don't know if the thing I got from the Sill people is still binding on me. This is the scale of the time dragon. I really don't want to leave it in the ash world to eat dust. While thinking about how to fan the flames at the beginning of the chaos, Shanka pretended to caress the obsidian bracelet on her wrist carelessly. After waiting for about half an hourglass, the jewelry store owner counted the gold drogs and silver cars in the safe. He took 3/10 of the silver cars as his monthly profit, neatly packed them in a thick sand rhinoceros skin bag, and handed it to his owner, Shanka. Shanka gave it to Edgar and asked him to keep it well. These silver coins were also called poisonous claws in the underworld. When demons touched them, they would feel itchy and painful. Although this hag definitely did not want to share the benefits with others, it was okay to give it to a mortal for temporary safekeeping. I'll take it with me when I leave, Shanka thought. Let's go. We'll go directly out of the city through the canal. Edgar carried the sand rhinoceros skin bag on his back, and then said to the jewelry store owner and Shanka, "We have to leave early. Although it's not too eye-catching to go by boat, the journey is a little longer. The merchant ships of Khedive may be arriving soon." Hearing this, the jewelry store owner hurriedly ran to the workshop behind store. Not long after, he came out pushing a small cart. The large box looked very heavy, and the wheels of the small cart squeaked under the weight. In the end, with the help of a few of Edgar's guards, the box was finally lifted to the hook outside the door of the carriage. The guards fed the underage sand rhinoceros some fried chickpeas, which was a little unhappy because of the weight. Only then did it reluctantly walk with heavy steps, carrying Edgar and Shanka, the jewelry store owner, and a team of guards who walked with them, step by step along the road to the small dock in the city's canal. At this time, there was already a transport ship docked there. The ship was about 30 steps long and 7 or 8 steps wide. There was a jib on the mast, and there were a few oars outside the cabin. When the jewelry store owner, Edgar, and Shanka walked into the cabin with the box of gold, a few of the acting consul's guards temporarily became the oarsmen. The water was sparkling, the jib was fully raised, and the oarsmen were rowing with all their might. The owner of the ship controlled the rudder to let the ship meander through the winding canal that flowed through the entire city of Spat. When they arrived at the water gate, a guard stepped forward and showed his master's seal. The guards at the water gate turned the winch and pulled up the iron gate, letting the acting consul who wanted to tour the Nero River at night out of the city. Tour the Nero River at night? Hearing the guards report, Numan, who had been standing on the city's watchtower, couldn't help but snort coldly. He was still disguised as Santos, so when he saw the displeasure on the face of the former consul and the most powerful patriarch in Spat, the guards kept quiet out of fear. Well, it's quite interesting to swim across the river. Numan thought of something and held a copper ball that he had just taken out from the mouth of the transmission lizard. It was the receipt sent by the special envoy of the Chamber of Commerce, the Orc Wolf Rider who was in charge of supervising this year's Festival of Heroes in Zimmerkamp. The words completed on it didn't make Numan think too much, but when he saw the other name besides Fezax, the contract demon in the form of a leviathan immediately felt relieved. Then, he remembered that a battle maniac of the Chamber of Commerce was refining the remaining divinity of Vaprak's avatar outside the city. Counting the days, he should be done with his work. The pressure in Numan's heart lessened a bit. The difference engine has already given me the premise of the strategy. As long as the ship leaves Spat City, I can do whatever I want. I can definitely make a fortune for the Chamber of Commerce. It's just a matter of how much I earn or not. Anyway, this task given by Lord Keys is safe. With this in mind, Numan no longer hesitated. He glanced at the steward of the Santos family who was standing beside him. He suspected that the steward was sent by the Pharaoh Mako of Bite City. He smiled and said, "I remember that your family is in Bite, right?" Ignoring the surprised look on Numan's face, the contract demon in human skin continued, "You haven't sent a letter home for a long time. Why don't you contact your family? Just tell them that the wind is blowing. Be careful of the house catching fire." After that, Numan stepped over the parapet of the city wall and jumped dozens of steps away into the cold main road of the Nero River outside the city. Including the steward who was awakened and the sergeant major of the Watergate Guards, several people who were standing on the city wall and did not dare to breathe loudly out of fear that Lord Santos would vent his anger on them could not help but gasp. The bright moonlight shone on the surface of the Nero River. Among the sparkling waves, a white line of water was vaguely seen flying toward the large commercial port outside the city like an unsheathed sword. On the dock, there were a few large ships docked there. The hulls of the ships were not of the more advanced structure commonly seen in this area. Instead, there were overlapping structures that looked like stacked scales. They should be large ships that traveled between Bite and Medici all year round. Chapter 892. Other than during the rainy season when the river level was high, the Nero River was polite and courteous most of the time. It would quietly carry the ships in its body and send them to their respective destinations. About 2 miles to the west of Spat was a commercial wharf. Most of the construction materials for the wharf were the wreckage of warships and other items left behind by the Japanese Expeditionary Force more than 50 years ago. Not a single bit was wasted. Of course, after the passage of time, the original construction materials had been smeared with tar to prevent pests, and new berths were added. Gradually, their original appearance was no longer recognizable. A few years ago, in order to house the tax collectors on the merchant ships, the former Governor Santos had specially opened a brick kiln to collect ash from the Nero River to bake bricks. A few dozen bungalows were built there to serve as the tax collector's office. This way, the tax collectors would not have to travel between Spat and their workplace every day. They could live in the wharf for a long time. Later, with the tax collector's office as the center, the merchant spontaneously built some warehouses to store their goods. The city of Spat had specially assigned a group of guards to maintain the law and order of the area. In addition, in order to centralize the transportation of goods, the mooring tower of the Leviathan airship was also moved to the wharf. As a result, the wharf gradually became a cargo distribution town attached to Spat. A few slightly old but somewhat large ships were docked at the dock at this moment, quietly waiting for the arrival of dawn. Some wind lanterns were hung on the ships, because they were filled with a high-efficiency fuel mixture of fish oil, paraffin, and tourmaline. These lanterns could be lit all night long. After the goods are unloaded, our ship will have to dock here for half a month. A captain sat on the side of the ship, smoking a pipe in his hand as he spoke to the chief officer who was supervising the workers on the deck. This ship has been sailing for more than 2 years. Who knows how many maggots have settled in the hull? It's a good idea to soak in fresh water so we don't have to go to the shipyard to get rid of them. The chief officer chuckled. He agreed with the captain's shrewdness. Instead of spending a few hundred silver coins to tow the ship to the shipyard and have it repaired with tar and tools, it was better to soak the ship in fresh water for half a month. Even though the rental fee for a berth in Spat was a little expensive, 200 silver cats was more than enough to cover half a month's salary. Moreover, this was a rare holiday for them. After the ship was dewormed and they had rested enough, they would load up the goods in Spat and sail down the river to the islands. This year would be another good year. Tell those boys to hurry up and, after smoking a pot of tobacco, the old captain put out the ashes and knocked his pipe against the side of the ship. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. Let's see if those guys who came with the cargo can still walk off a ship on their own. Don't you think those islands overseas are strange? There are actually some dark and swarthy desert elves, and their physiques are simply too weak. I'm really afraid that they will die on the way, and we won't be able to answer to those customers. The first mate nodded in agreement. Then, he instructed a few of the sailors to help him supervise the unloading of the goods. Then, he walked the stairs on the deck. The desert elves who brought the cargo didn't live in the cabin at the stern, but chose to live in the darkness below the deck, which made him a little puzzled. Bang, bang, bang. Walking to a cabin below the deck, the chief officer knocked on the wooden door. How are you guys now? The captain asked me to call you out for some fresh air. We've been eating and drinking in the same cabin all this time. I'm going to get sick from holding it in. He shouted for a long time, but no one responded to him. Shocked, he hurriedly pushed open the wooden door, and the hinges creaked. The cabin was pitch black. What's wrong with them? They don't even light up at night. The chief officer secretly cursed, then picked up a small tourmaline flashlight from his waist, turned on the light, and shone it into the cabin. Where did they go? He was surprised. The dozen or so dark-skinned desert elves he had been looking for a long time were nowhere to be seen. But just as he turned around and was about to go to the deck to report the situation to the captain, a tall figure suddenly appeared in front of him. Naaman grinned, and the water of the Nero River dripped from his wet robe, forming a puddle at his feet. Sorry, I'll have to borrow your skin. As he spoke, the demon reached out his finger and pointed at the chief officer's forehead. Go to sleep. Before the chief officer's limp body fell to the ground, Naaman grabbed his arm and pushed him into the depths of the cabin. Not long after a rustling sound of clothes rubbing against each other, Naaman, who was wearing a bare arm shirt, shorts, and other sailor attire, walked out. His face and figure had become no different from the first mate. Where did those drows go? Naaman thought for a moment, and a small spray bottle appeared in his hand. Puff, puff, Naaman sprayed twice, and the effect was immediate. A series of fluorescent green footprints appeared on the wooden floor of the cabin. Naaman smiled and strode forward, following the footsteps. Just now, when he knocked out the chief officer in the cabin, he used hypnosis. To change his appearance, he used the contract demon's disguise talent. To find the footprints, he used a kind of alchemy potion. From the time he sneaked into the ship until now, Naaman did not use any spells, so naturally, he did not emit any magic waves. Drows were born with some superficial spell-like abilities, and some of the nobles' spell-like abilities were even comparable to that of warlocks. This evil race had given birth to many spellcasters. Therefore, Naaman, who wanted to catch the thief with the goods, had the intention of not using any spells from the very beginning, so as to avoid alerting the enemy. He walked up to the deck and circled around to the poop. Sure enough, he saw traces of drows on the rope that dropped the anchor. If they did not go ashore from the berth, the distance from here to the dock was only about 20 yards. Even if the drows were poor swimmers, with the natural agility of their race, it should not be too difficult for them to hold their breath and swim all the way to the dock. Naaman thought for a moment and decided not to use the same method of landing as the drow. After all, he was now the first mate of the ship and could easily disembark from the anchorage. Naaman bade the captain farewell and said that he would go to the storehouse to check it out. Naaman then trotted along the anchorage and retraced the drow footprints along the shore. Chapter 893. A few crows were perched on a tree, looking around with their large gray-blue eyes as if they were guards. They were the guards. Hiding behind an acacia tree, Naaman stared at a row of shacks built with reeds and river mud not far in front of him. He could not help but sneer in his heart. I can't believe that the drows, who have always liked to show off, would meet in such a place. He took out a handheld weapon that looked like an electromagnetic nail gun. Compared to a normal electromagnetic nail gun, this gun's barrel was much longer. Soon, all the lights in the shack were extinguished, and a few people dressed in armor and guards rushed out. They were carefully searching the area with swords and sabers. However, at some point in time, Naaman had already entered the crown of the acacia tree. The guards that came out were not drows. Naaman had already noticed that. Drows would not light up lamps in the dark. The only reason why the dark-skinned elves who live in the underworld would appear here was because they had chosen this place as a warehouse. They used Khadiv's name to gather the spat jewelry craftsmen here and had them leave the gold here. Then, at another location, they left some special goods for Khadiv's subordinates who carried the silver cate. Once the transaction was completed, Khadiv's subordinates would hand over the silver cate to the jewelry craftsmen waiting in the shack. After the three parties completed the transaction and the two parties left, the drow would then return to the shack to take the gold. Up until now, they had been very careful and did not expose themselves in front of the two parties. As for the double-cross situation, it would be avoided by Khadiv's own kind hidden among his agents. What a bunch of troublesome fellows. After figuring out the crux of the matter, Naaman could not help but secretly criticize. However, when he thought of the comment left by the elder of the scale of perpetual order when he wrote about his race, Naaman understood. Complicating a simple problem and making a complex problem unsolvable. This is how the drow race, born with the talent of the top race in the material plane, gradually declined. And this decline made it easier for the Spider Queen to control them. He guessed that a talented drow spellcaster like Snyder did not use other methods to increase his lifespan, but resolutely turned himself into an undead creature like a lich. She guessed that Snyder must have been fed up with the inferiority of this race and wanted to cut ties with it completely. At the same time, it was no wonder that Snyder's plan was so vicious when he plotted against the drow. TSK. Naaman could not help but secretly click his tongue. A few drows, drenched from head to toe, were hiding in a basement, draped in spider silk robes. They had just used a spell to summon this hiding place and then peacefully monitored the movements in the trading area above them. This place was located at the outer edge of the trading area outside Spat. Usually, no one would come here. Not long after, when the first rustling sound of footsteps could be heard, many more disorderly footsteps could be heard one after another. The members of the Khadiv family came one after another. According to the previous agreement, they each sent only one person. After all, the things to be taken were not very heavy. One person could carry them all. The problem was how to distribute them. Under a lush tulip tree, the 7 of them showed their Khadiv family badges to each other, and that was the start of the meeting. In front of them were 10 bags made of spider silk. When someone tried to pick them up, there were clanking sounds inside. It was obvious that there were bottles and jars inside. I want at least 2 bags. The one who spoke was Khalil, one of Khadiv's men. The previous head of the Khalil family was originally a pasha. After the Wozang Empire was completely defeated, the previous pharaoh, Asinder, gave him the position of Khedive to manage an overseas enclave. His original pasha territory was on the northern coast of Medici. Therefore, he controlled both ends of the sea route and the overseas enclave. The family's strength had increased rapidly, and they were one of the best among the Khedive. However, before he finished speaking, someone immediately jumped out to oppose him. This person was holding a badge with the Shattered Islands imprinted on it. He was the representative of the Khedive of the archipelago. Zagan was originally a pasha as well, but later on, the pharaoh directly conferred him the title of Khedive of the archipelago. However, unlike Khalil Pasha, who was given an overseas enclave that belonged to the Wozang Empire, the Zagan family's territory was always the hundreds of islands of the archipelago. Therefore, his family's power was smaller than that of the Khalil family. The Zagan family and the Khalil family had always been at odds. In the beginning, it was because there would always be some self-organized pirates among the people of the archipelago. They would rob the villages that were originally in Khalil Pasha's territory. Later on, when Khalil became the Khedive, he used the overseas enclave to expand his naval fleet. Instead, he began to rob the villages of the archipelago. The two families became more and more irreconcilable. The representative of the Khedive spat out a mouthful of thick phlegm and pulled out the scimitar at his waist with a clang. In the end, they were the people of the archipelago who had been rich in pirates for generations. If there was a disagreement, they would draw their swords. I didn't hear you clearly. How many bags did you say you want to take? But let me say this first. No matter how many you take, I will take one more bag than him, even if it means risking my life. Our Zagan family's brewery is about to open soon, and the demand for seasoning has not been met. As he spoke, he tore open his clothes and used his scimitar to hit the armor inside. Did you see that? I am wearing the zealot armor. If you don't agree with my suggestion, he changed the topic and looked at the representatives of the various families with a sinister look. Then I am sorry. I'm not afraid of death. At most, I will break all these bottles and jars. Let's see what you will do then. Under the effect of magic, the Khedive representatives quarreled, threatened, and intimidated one after another. Not a single word was missed. All of it was completely transmitted to the ears of the group of drows hidden underground. These evil creatures all looked happy. Chaos and strife were the best medicine for them to relieve their tiredness. Moreover, in their eyes, this group of people was just talking and could not be taken seriously. After all, they only sought benefits. Even if they quarreled fiercely now, they would have to compromise in the end. Chapter 894. As the quarrel escalated, more and more sounds of swords being unsheathed could be heard. The drows who were hiding in the basement and listening to the noise were also starting to hesitate. Were these people really going to fight? We can't let them fight. That'll spoil. Before the leading drow noble could finish speaking, a muffled rumble came from above. The tremors passed through the soil and rocks into the basement that had been summoned with a spell. It was a good thing he didn't bite his tongue. Something's wrong. Something's wrong with this commotion. The drows all shuddered. This level of commotion wasn't something that Khedive's followers could cause. Not to mention whether they had the ability to do so, the average size of a human wouldn't be enough to shake the earth. That was indeed the case. In fact, whether it was Khalil and Zagan, Khedive's two subordinates who were arguing until their faces turned red, or Khedive's confidants who had been sent to retrieve goods, they all drew their swords because they had encountered an unexpected attack. More than a dozen monsters that looked like mountains of flesh charged out of the night. They didn't even waste time talking to them. They swung clubs and flails that were as big as saplings and smashed them right in their faces. Ogres. These monsters are ogres, and there are also mountain giants. A few of Khedive's experienced disciples, after the initial panic, immediately recognized what kind of monster was attacking them. Some of the smarter ones, like the representative of the Zagan family, immediately bent down and grabbed a bag of spider silk, slung it over their shoulders, and ran without another word. Some of the slow-witted ones, or perhaps those who were confident in their own strength, brandished their swords and charged at the enemies. However, the ones who ran first were all forced back to their original positions by another group of ogres and mountain giants. As for those who fought bravely, their courage was commendable. However, there were simply too many monsters, and they were all covered in thick armor. In addition, their innate strength was not something that ordinary people could match. Therefore, after a few exchanges, they were all smashed to pieces. How dare you? At some point, a drow suddenly appeared under the tree. He glared with his scarlet eyes and began to curse the ogres and hill giants in Jotun. Generally speaking, among the many monsters living in the material plane, the drows still had some face. These dark-skinned elves living in the underground were notorious for their cruelty and cunning, and they could still intimidate many monsters. However, the ogres and hill giants turned a deaf ear to the sudden appearance of the drow. Some of them even took the initiative to attack him. It was as if they were possessed. They waved their weapons around, making whooshing noises. They were not stingy at all. You're courting death. Suddenly, a few more drows jumped out, and as soon as they appeared, they all cast dark magic. While the ogres and hill giants were circling in the black fog, they raised their poisoned crossbows and fired at the same time. More than a dozen crossbow bolts shot into the black fog. In a series of ding, 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 ding sounds, there were always a few poochie-poochie sounds of arrowheads piercing into flesh. Then there were miserable howls, and a large amount of black blood flowed out of the thick fog. But that was all. The remaining ogres and hill giants did not seem to be afraid of the tragic death of their companions. At this moment, they were simply too brave to be ogres or hill giants. Ogres and hill giants who were not afraid of death. Among the drows, some began to whisper in Jotun. There were only 17 of them. Even if there were 3 mages among them, if they really wanted to fight more than 30 huge monsters, they were afraid that they would pay a lot of casualties. None of the drows were willing to bet whether they were one of them. They were also puzzled in their hearts. Where did these monsters come from? Why were they so fearless of death? Unfortunately, not only was there no one to answer this question, but just as they fell into a bitter battle, the footsteps of more than a dozen monsters sounded in the dark night. Where did so many monsters come from? Every drow was now scared out of their wits. In just a short time, a total of 70 to 80 ogres and hill giants ran out. One must know that these two kinds of monsters usually liked to fight among themselves. A tribe organized by a family would at most have a dozen ogres or a few hill giants, which was already considered a large group. Now that nearly 3 digits of monsters appeared all of a sudden, there was obviously someone behind the scenes controlling them. Retreat. We'll retreat after we get the gold. We've been exposed. It was the leader of the drows who reacted the fastest. He immediately realized that the most likely force to control so many monsters and only attack them was the Chamber of Commerce called Scales of Eternal Order. Although they had done an investigation before leaving and did not find any signs of ogres or hill giants, who could say for sure whether this was the foundation of the Chamber of Commerce? Of course, the answer was definitely no. Why would the Scales of Eternity keep ogres and hill giants as warriors for no reason? The ogres and hill giants that were beating up the drows here were actually just small fries that were forced to come here by Neru, who had just finished refining Vaprak's divine power. The ogre had at most given them a full set of weapons and equipment. As for why they became so powerful, it was entirely because these monsters had been completely subdued by this new ogre after witnessing the battle between Neru and Vaprak. They were in awe of this new ogre powerhouse. Since God wanted them to kill the humans and drows who participated in the trade here, then they must complete this mission. These monsters, who were not very smart, were now not too afraid of death. In their view, if they died to complete their mission, they would be favored by the new ogre god, Neru. Then their souls could ascend to his divine kingdom and become petitioners to enjoy glory and happiness. And if they were not going to die, then what reason did they have to be afraid of? It was nothing more than some humans and drows. Even if they were a little dangerous, it would at most take some effort. Wouldn't it be fine to just raise the weapons in their hands and crush these guys who were regarded as enemies by God? Chapter 895. 70 to 83-story tall monsters were wreaking havoc outside the trading port of Spat City. Fortunately, there were not many people here. Otherwise, even if they heard the noise and stayed in the shack, they would have been in vain. After all, the intelligence of the ogres and the hill giants was very average. Although Luling had ordered them not to go deep into the core area of the trading port, how could they distinguish between north, south, east, and west when they were really in a frenzy? A bunch of idiots. Glancing at the monsters behind him, the drow noble who led the team to trade for gold snorted disdainfully. With the help of a secret spell, he moved forward like a ghost, sticking close to the streets and alleys. Ordinary people could not see his figure at all. I've already left my doppelganger at the periphery of the battle. It will take those idiots and flee in all directions. Since the scale of perpetual order has launched an attack, they probably won't be able to escape this time. So I'm the only one who will go get the gold and quickly leave this place in the chaos. His reasoning was very rigorous, and his idea was very reasonable. When he had warned his compatriots and proposed the second plan of breaking out of the encirclement, he had decisively adopted the third plan. As a drow noble, double dealing was a professional education he had received since he was a child, so he naturally understood the three meanings of double dealing. At this time, he still had a trump card in his hand. His fellow drow compatriots did not know that the spider silk robe he was wearing was actually an enchanted tool. When he took it off and unfolded it, it could become a flying carpet. This was the tool he had imitated after he came to the Ashen World and bought the flying carpet from some merchants in the Medici Empire. It took him a lot of effort to figure out the manufacturing principle of the flying carpet. His hard work paid off, and now this tool finally came in handy. When he arrived at the warehouse where he had chosen to let the jewelry craftsman stay, he would rob as much as he could. After that, he would immediately fly away on the flying carpet. Before leaving, he slaughtered a dozen slaves and used their souls to fill the 10 obsidian magic beads with energy. With these obsidian magic beads, his flying carpet could fly at the fastest speed and fly all the way to the outside of the Megalosaurus Pasha's territory. At that time, wouldn't he be able to fly freely? Something's wrong. Let's retreat, Shanka said hurriedly. The night hag's hearing was many times better than a mortal's. She had heard the commotion as soon as the ogres and hill giants attacked. There was no doubt that tonight's three-way deal had gone awry. However, Shanka did not know whether this was caused by the scale of perpetual order or whether it was a case of double-cross. The former was indeed possible. After all, the scale of perpetual order was very powerful and had many eyes and ears. Even if it was not well known in the Ashen World, Shanka knew its background. However, the reason why she suspected that the monsters were a group of ogres and hill giants was because she sensed that the monsters were a group of ogres and hill giants. Previously, when she was involved in the conspiracy of the Sierrians, she more or less knew the inside story of the invasion of the Ash World. She knew that these ogres and hill giants were not reared by the scales of eternity. Secondly, there were drows involved in the three-way deal. She had never been stingy in her estimation of the moral bottom line of this shit-stirring race. Perhaps these ogres and hill giants were something that they had created to deceive others. If we retreat now, what about the deal? Edgar's words awakened Shanka from her thoughts. At this time, the flames, explosions, and roars in the distance had also awakened the jewelry merchants who were waiting silently in the shack. Glancing at the frightened merchants, Shanka tried her best to suppress the greedy nature of the hags. Let's not worry about that now. Let's take our share of the gold. We can't care about other things. After that, she pulled Edgar and walked out of the shack. The guards who followed the acting governor helped the boss of the store of many treasures lift the big box that had been transported over. They followed their master all the way to the Nero River. When they came, the merchant ship that they had taken was docked there. When we get on the ship, even if we are found with the gold, Just say that it's ballast, Shanka told Edgar as they walked forward. She felt that as the acting governor of Spat City, Edgar was still of some value. At least, he could let her return to the city safely. As for after entering the city, with the protection of the Altoros demon, even if the matter was exposed, she should be able to escape from the Ash world and return to the gray wilderness safely. At worst, I'll stop studying this thing. Thinking of this, the hags could not help but clench the obsidian bracelet that she had taken off from her wrist. The greed in her nature made it difficult for her to give up the treasure that she had already obtained. However, when it rains, it pours. Just as the group of people were about to approach the cargo ship docked at the shore, a strange figure suddenly walked out of the cabin. Without any hesitation, the guards who were responsible for protecting Edgar's safety pulled out their machetes and crossbows. The man on the ship, who was wearing a sailor's jacket, held a long-handled battle axe in his hand. Blood dripped from the blade of the axe. Under the bright moonlight, the guards, the owner, and the crew who had been left on the ship were all lying on the deck. "What are you looking at?" Naaman picked up a can of lager with his left hand, which he had just found in the cabin. He gulped down a few mouthfuls and said, "I just came here to order a few leaf flowers. Who would have thought that they were so useless and had such a bad temper? I could only open a few holes in their bodies to vent their sour resentment." As he spoke, he threw the beer can in his hand off the ship and smashed it in front of Edgar's guards. The cat ran out of the bag. "Why don't you try it too?" Without any reason, a gust of wind swept over, and the sawtooth on the long-handled battle axe kept creaking because of the rapid rotation. Naaman, who was pretending to be a sailor, stepped on the side of the ship and jumped onto the shore. Without any nonsense, he directly swung his chainsaw battle axe and attacked the guards who were confused by the series of events. The battle axe flew in all directions, and there was no enemy in front of him. Naaman had pretended to be a pirate many times since he had pretended to be a pirate in the Ramsey Plain. Now, his performance could be described as flawless. Even the way they wielded their battle axes and fought, and the steps they took when advancing and retreating looked no different from a real pirate. Ruthless, rude, and unscrupulous, these were the feelings of the guards who faced the battle axe directly. Blood, flesh, and limbs flew everywhere. It was almost a matter of one person and one battle axe. Naaman easily killed these guards. Minced flesh and blood dripped from the battle axe. Naaman walked towards Edgar and the others with a grim smile. "Whose men are you? Do you know who I am?" Seeing this, the acting governor roared fiercely. The leader of the night ghosts pretended to be trembling, but in fact there was a sharp bone dagger in her hand hidden in her sleeve. "I'll let you know the reason before you die." Naaman grinned hideously. "The big landlord of Bite City wants to borrow your head to make a mess here." Puff! Naaman's head flew up, and blood gushed out more than 3 feet high. Edgar looked at his paralyzed body on the ground, and then looked at his wife who had beheaded him with a dagger. He was puzzled. However, this was all he could do. Chapter 896. If Pharaoh wants him to die today, he won't live until dawn, Shanka said with a chuckle. Such a relaxed tone, coupled with her blood-stained white makeup, really made people feel uneasy. Your lady, the owner of the Bountiful Treasures Pavilion, behind her held onto the bone dagger that was stuck in his heart. He stumbled back a few steps and fell to the ground with a thud. As if she had done something casual, Shanka smiled at Naaman, turned around, and walked to the gold box on the ground. She just wanted to take what belonged to her and leave this place quickly. Naaman, who was standing in front of Shanka, suddenly sat down on the golden box without any hesitation. He crossed his legs, took out a piece of chicken skin cloth, and wiped the blood on the blade of the axe. Shanka's eyes were cold. As a night hag, she instinctively didn't want to give up the gold in the box. Others might be a little afraid of the pirate in front of her, but she was not so afraid. "I'm not your opponent." Naaman was very self-aware. Even if he could deal with the leader of the Night Hag Legion alone, he would most likely be injured. However, he was not alone. Just when Shanka was a little confused by Naaman's words, she suddenly felt something hard poking her back. She was frightened, and without thinking, she wanted to use advanced teleportation to escape. However, she was still one step late. A large amount of sticky, honey-like liquid wrapped around her body, not only restricting her movement, but also blocking her ability to use spells. What the hell is this? Shanka was shocked. Amber's seal. As if to answer her, but also as if to warn her, the steampunk half-lich's body came out of the void. A new type of compound spell that I developed myself. I originally wanted to use it to deal with a demon lord, but that short-lived grandson died first. It's a waste to use it to deal with a night hag like you. By the way, this is a compound sealing spell. It's also fused with some miscellaneous spells. I can't remember how many there are. If you're honest, they won't be activated. If you're not honest, I remember that the first one to be activated should be the Finger of Death. If you don't believe me, you could try it. If he tried, he would die. Snatch the bamboo shoots. Naaman, who had heard the entire conversation, thought to himself. At the same time, the danger level of this veteran member of the scale of perpetual order had increased by quite a bit. This is just a part of the gold. Snyder walked to Naaman and waved his hand. After a wave of magic, the giant piece of amber quickly shrank and fell into his mechanical prosthesis. The rest of the gold is still in the place where they traded. Let's go get it. Naaman grinned, imitating the crude pirate perfectly. Don't worry, it's not just the gold. There's also the silver Khedive's representatives. Someone will help us get it. With this money, even if a street in Spad is blown to the sky, we can build new houses on the spot. Just as Naaman and Snyder were chatting, the massacre outside the trading port gradually came to an end. 16 dark elves, plus 7 representatives sent by Khedive, tried their best to kill more than 20 ogres and hill giants. But in the end, they were no match for these fearless monsters. They were surrounded by them and smashed into meat paste with giant hammers. Moreover, as soon as these monsters attacked, a group of desert elves found a sand rhino team that was transporting the silver Khedive's silver Khedive. They killed all the riders who were controlling the pack beasts, not leaving a single one alive. Then, they led all the pack beasts into the wilderness. If someone followed the tracks, they would be able to follow them all the way to the manor of Little Glow. At the same time, the only drow noble who had escaped the net walked into the shack full of gold and jewelry merchants waiting for the transaction right after Sanka and Edgar left. Ruthless as he was, he directly slit everyone's neck with a poisoned curved sword. Then he untied his spider silk robe and unfolded all the folds inside, forming a flying carpet that covered almost the entire shack. Seeing that no one was chasing after him, he boldly moved all the gold onto the carpet and immediately chanted a spell to soar into the sky. With the power of the obsidian magic orb, he was confident that he could run out of the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha before dawn. Although he could not escape on the carpet during the day due to his fear of sunlight, he could find a small caravan to kill and search for their souls to recharge the obsidian magic orb. By tomorrow night, he could fly to the northern coastal area of the Medici Empire. As long as he could reach there, he would be able to rest easy, whether it was finding a ship or waiting until nighttime to continue flying on the carpet. There would not be too much trouble to return to the family's camp. The key is tonight. As long as I can drive out of the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha, I will be halfway to success. The drow noble sat in the front of the carpet. The cold night wind in the sky made him feel a little cold. However, it had been more than 2 hourglasses since he took off to escape. At present, he had completely left Spat City behind. On the ground was the vast desert and the winding Nero River. The drow's eyesight was excellent. Even if he was flying high in the sky, he could still see the sparkling Nero River under the moonlight. In fact, because he did not know the terrain of this area very well, he did not dare to deviate too far from the river. He could only control the carpet and move in the direction of the river. The drow noble who had been paying attention to the direction of the river suddenly saw a black shadow flash on the river. Is it a water monster living in the Nero River? Judging from its height and the size of a shadow, the monster was not small. However, he immediately realized that he had made a mistake in his judgment. That shadow was not a wandering water monster at all, but a shadow cast by some giant flying above his head. Moreover, it was not just one, but three. The drowned noble suddenly looked up and saw a scene that made his heart tremble. Three blue dragons, who were about to reach adulthood, were hovering above him. Iron Tail, Gorgia lowered his head and happened to meet the drowned noble's gaze. Meruz, Anidos, that little thing has found us. Meruz, who is often called Short Tail by his litter brother Gorgia, grinned. There seemed to be lightning in his throat. Then what are we waiting for? The hunt has begun. After that, the reckless Megalosaurus folded its wings and swooped down like a cannonball toward the drowned noble who was scared out of his wits. His two companions saw this and did not have time to ridicule him for his recklessness. They also circled around from both sides to block any possible escape route of the flying carpet. It was true that birds could fly freely in the sky. However, if these flying birds encountered the Megalosaurus that dominated the sky, they would either become playthings or prey. Chapter 897. The light of dawn gushed out. The fragrance of the desert, the cold air of the rocks after a night, and the smell of the waves of the Nero River were all mixed together in a bowl of meatball soup that the Spartans regarded as a holy breakfast. If someone thought that such a beautiful description was too strange, perhaps only a hopeless author or a lovesick poet would say such a thing. Perhaps that person's idea was not wrong. But the Spartans who loved meatball soup would not think that there was even a hint of hypocrisy in those words. Another bowl, with more coriander. After drinking the eighth bowl of meatballs and the soup, Miles, who was in his human form, still felt that it was not enough. So he threw a few copper coins into the cash box in the breakfast shed and asked the owner to give him another bowl of meatball soup to fill the gap between his teeth. That's right, it was to fill the gap between his teeth. For a Megalosaurus who was about to reach adulthood, this amount of food was just enough to fill the gap between his teeth. If he wanted to eat his fill, he would need at least one well-roasted camel. But barbecuing was just seasoning. How could it compare to soup made with dried shrimps, fresh coriander, and soft meatballs with thin skin and soft stuffing? You're so picky. Be careful that your tail won't grow long when you reach adulthood, Anidos kindly reminded him. But he had also eaten 2 bowls of meatball soup, and now he was hesitating whether he should have another bowl. Huff, 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 Miles muttered softly, and then drank the soup again. But this time, he at least had a bowl of meatballs left. Do you want to learn from that guy? Miles raised his head and glanced at Gorgias, who was standing outside the breakfast shed enjoying the wind. Then he rolled his eyes and looked at Anidos. Eat or mix with rice every day? What happened in the end? You still have to pretend to be iron. Seeing Gorgias turn his head to look at him, Anidos grabbed a handful of meatballs and stuffed them into Miles' mouth. Then he smiled helplessly at Miles. Iron Tail was Gorgias' nickname. It was because when he was a young dragon, someone once cut off his tail with a sharp weapon. However, he was the strongest of the 3 dragons. The reason why his tail was chopped off was because the situation was urgent. He had to stay behind to cover for his brothers. Not only do you have a short tail, you're also a simple-minded person, Anidos thought to himself as he glanced at Meruz, who was munching on a meatball. However, we don't have to wear Gorgia's mechanical prosthesis for too long. Lord Keys had already added the Troll Regeneration Potion option to the Chamber of Commerce's exchange list. After completing this mission, Gorgia can go back and change his tail. However, just as Anidos was thinking to himself, Gorgia, who was standing outside the breakfast shed, took large strides toward a stall owner who was in a hurry. The vendor looked to be in his 30s. He was so skinny that he looked like he was just a bag of bones. He was stooped and carried a shoulder pole. There were 2 rattan baskets with some pots in each. Gorgia was wearing a blue suit and was much taller than ordinary people. Although he didn't have any swords on him, his murderous aura couldn't be faked. He took a few steps forward and arrived in front of the vendor. He didn't say anything and just blocked the vendor's path. Many people's gazes were attracted by the two. Because they were at the gate of Spat, some people who were still active quickly ran to the gate guards to report. What are you doing? Do you want to buy something? The vendor asked with a smile. Gorgia still didn't answer. He only raised his head and looked at the group of guards who had received the report and were rushing over. The vendor also looked back, murderous intent surging in his eyes. "It's quite heavy." Gorgias suddenly stretched out his hand and took the shoulder pole from the vendor's shoulder. Then, he casually threw the 2 baskets of pots onto the bluestone road. It was a good thing that they didn't smash the bluestone road. The vendor had a sinister look in his eyes. His originally skinny body was now emitting a fierce aura. The earthworm-like blood vessels were spreading from his neck to his face. Teeth were protruding from his lips, and his mouth was growing forward. Fine hair was growing from the surface of his skin, and soon it was leaking out of his clothes. Werewolf. At the gate of Spat, many merchants came and went. Some of them were quite knowledgeable. Therefore, when the vendor began to transform, someone called out his identity. Then, those people hurriedly ran in the direction of the guards who came to deal with the problem. They knew what kind of people werewolves were. Not to mention that these monsters were extremely ferocious and liked to eat people. Even if they were bitten, if they didn't buy expensive life-saving potions in time, they would most likely end up as a werewolf. Werewolf. Gorgia coldly snorted. "Are your eyes holes for breathing? You actually mistook a jackal from the lower realm for a werewolf." Then, he looked at the jackal who was about to complete his transformation. "But I didn't expect that there would be an unexpected gain after wasting some time at the gate. Take this guy." Seeing that he was exposed, the jackal immediately rushed to Gorgia. His legs had become inverted, and his jumping power was amazing. With just a light jump, he jumped a distance of 2 to 3 yards. In his hand, there was a short dagger with a blue blade. It was obvious that it had been dipped in poison. However, it didn't hit the target. Even if it was dipped in poison, it was useless. The sharp blade pierced through a layer of shadow, and Gorgia's body burst like a bubble. When he appeared again, this human megalosaurus was already standing behind the jackal, and his hand was already on the monster's neck. "Kneel down." A surging aura and an unparalleled force attacked at the same time. Gorgia was like dealing with a kitten or a puppy. He grabbed the jackal's neck and pushed it to the ground. "Rinse your mouth." Then, Gorgia spat out a word that couldn't be pronounced by human tongue. The blue dragon's innate spell-like ability, Water Creation Spell, was activated. A large amount of clear water appeared in the jackal's throat out of thin air. After a series of gurgling sounds, the jackal, whose stomach was as round as a ball, couldn't move anymore. Ugh, ugh, ugh. Clear water gushed out from the monster's mouth and nostrils. If it weren't for the vitality of this lower realm's demons, he would have already died from electrolyte imbalance or drowned. Naturally, Anidos and Miles had also noticed the situation. They didn't bother with Gorgia. Dealing with a mere jackal wouldn't be a problem for powerful true dragons. Instead, they began to inspect the 2 baskets of jars that Gorgia had thrown to the side. Anidos opened them one by one, revealing the unique halo of a golden drogon. Chapter 898. An unexpected gain. Icing on the cake. Miles and Anidos were slightly surprised when they opened the jars. They were ordered to capture the drow last night, and their goal was to snatch the gold that the drow had taken away. The gold was now in Gorgia's stomach and was being kept safe. While they were eating breakfast, they did not expect to come across another batch of gold that was secretly brought out of the city by a jackal. "How did you find this jackal?" Miles asked curiously as she looked at the jackal that was lying on the ground and spitting out water. This kind of lower realm demon can transform into 3 forms: a human, a jackal, and a half-human and half-jackal. Although they are similar to were creatures, this ability of theirs is a kind of innate ability, and there won't be any flaws after they transform. "I didn't eat the meatball soup, didn't eat the coriander, didn't drink the soup, and didn't eat the peppered meatballs," Gorgias said coldly. He tried his best to control his saliva and put on an arrogant look. Naturally, I could smell the scent of the gold that the jackal was carrying. Some of the gold in this batch also has the scent of the gold from yesterday. It was handled by the same group of people, so naturally, it couldn't escape my nose. Good fellow, good fellow. That was the word that came to Miles and Anido's mind. As expected of Lord Keys, Gorgia, who ate dirt for a living every day, had an amazing nose. They then looked at the jackal that was lying in the water that it had spat out. It looked like a drowning dog. This guy was obviously a dog, but his nose was not as sensitive as a megalosaurus like Gorgia. It deserved to die. Short tail, Miles kicked the drowning dog and sent it flying into a ditch by the roadside. He looked at the guards who were standing nearby and, hesitating, then pointed at the jackal. He probably won't survive. Skin him and take him back to the city. We can exchange him for some money at Senator Santos' house. After saying that, he looked at Gorgia, the blue dragon, who was about to reach adulthood and was the most powerful one in the triple dragon combination, opened its mouth wide in front of everyone's astonished eyes. Galder's mouth was half a foot wider than the door. It swallowed the 2 baskets of gold into its throat. Enter the city and report. Gorgia, who had finished swallowing, said calmly as if he had done something insignificant. Not long after, the news of the strange incident at the city gates spread throughout Sparred City as people entered the city to work or do business. However, some people's focus was on the sudden appearance of the jackal, while some people were amazed by Gorgia's ability to swallow 2 baskets in one go. A bunch of trash. A deafening barking sound came from the depths of the acting governor's mansion. Strangely enough, even though his voice was loud and clear, it didn't leak out at all when it hit the courtyard's walls. The neighbors and pedestrians acted as if they didn't hear it at all. Only the servants in the mansion, as well as some of Edgar's personal guards who stayed here to protect the mansion, trembled in fear when they heard this. They all knew that their master, the powerful Lord Altoros Morgul Lalic, was very angry now. Originally, when Shankar and Edgar went out of the city to trade, Night Hag left Joel Lalic in the city to guard the money she had received from Edgar. For a greedy old hag, great strength, supreme authority, and golden calamity coins were all things she was unwilling to part with in her life. However, she overestimated the integrity of the Altoros demon. She asked Joel Lalic to guard the money, which was no different from asking a dog to guard a bone. Although Joel Lalic was her champion fighter and had to do his best to satisfy her needs, which Altoros demon didn't want to find loopholes in the contract and kill his mistress to gain complete freedom. Therefore, when Shankar went out of the city, Joel Lalic, who couldn't hold back his evil thoughts, did something. First, he bit all the living people in the mansion and turned them into jackals. Then, he sent a few jackals to disguise themselves as ordinary mortals and sent the money that Shankar had plundered in the Ash world out of spat in batches. After transforming into an Altoros demon, Gorlick had lost the naivety of a barbarian god in the past. He had completely become a cunning and changeable Yugalos demon. He knew the value of the disaster coins. Whether it was used to negotiate with Shankar, make her change some terms of the contract, or hide them for future use or enjoyment, it was 100 times better than leaving them in the hands of his mistress. What's more, he felt that he deserved it. Without my protection, a weak night hag would have been crushed into dust without even being able to fight back. Lalic felt very at ease when he embezzled the money. But just now, he had received a series of bad news. The jackals under his control died one after another after leaving Spat City. Judging from the way they died, it was even more incredible. Some jackals were forced to death by water. Some lost their way and walked into a monster's nest and were swallowed by the monster, and some simply ended their own lives. What was going on? He had clearly ordered those guys to go to the hiding places that he had secretly chosen after leaving the city. Joel Lalic could guarantee that the monsters around these places had been cleared by him, and there was no danger at all. In the eyes of outsiders, most of these places were ordinary places. Now, he wanted to find out what had happened to those jackals and find those precious disaster coins. However, before Shanka went out, she had specifically told him to stay in the house and look after the house. As the champion fighter of a night hag, he was bound by the contract and could not disobey Shanka's orders. Damn bastard, Joel Lalic cursed in his heart. Because he was insulting Shankar, he could not say it out loud. Perhaps he was bored enough, so he summoned a butcher in the mansion. As Edgar's house consisted of a large compound, it was necessary to furnish the viceregal, the armed soldiers, and other clingers with lodging, as well as with food and drink. Therefore, there were also some bakers, winemakers, and butchers in the mansion who provided meat for the residents. Of course, the butcher was now transformed into a jackal by Gol Lalick. He pulled a bull, hung the bull by its hind legs on a thick oak tree in front of his master, and then stabbed the bull's neck with a knife. Hot blood gushed out of the blade and fell into a wooden bucket on the ground. After the blood flowed out and the bull collapsed on the ground, the butcher began to cut pieces of fresh meat from its body and put them on the skewer to cook food for Gol Lalick on the spot. "If you don't let me go out, I'll eat all the animals in this mansion," Altoros thought fiercely. He was looking forward to the expression on Edgar's face when he came back, and a scene that Shankar tried to explain and cover up. Chapter 899. On this day, the sun and rain alternately poured onto the earth. Edgar's mansion was located at the edge of the city. Like the manors of many prominent and wealthy families, this mansion was too large to be built in the center of the city. The blue fireproof stone tiles on the house and the walls shone with a sapphire blue luster like starling eggs under the sun. Edgar's mansion was the largest building complex in the area. Some of the smaller families could not compare to it. The streets where the common townspeople mingled smelled of stables, of unwashed men, and of cooking in kitchens. Dogs barked, children shrieked, men shouted, and women giggled from the first light of day. Blacksmiths hammered horseshoes. Carpenters broke the trunks of trees with axes. The west wind blew clouds across the sky, and their shadows chased one another over their roofs. The ones who broke the atmosphere were squads of soldiers in maroon uniforms. The clothes they wore, the flags they carried, and the weapons they held in their hands were all symbols of their identity. The garrison of Spat. In the Medici Empire, the garrison of every city belonged to the pharaoh and Bite. The consul of each city only had the temporary command and deployment authority of the city's garrison troops. Of course, this rule was an exception in Nome Province, the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha. The garrison of Spat was the symbol of Key's rule over the city. Although they served the various consuls, the consuls of this city had never been produced outside of Santos and Glow in the past few decades. It was not until something happened to the Glow family that the nominal command of the garrison was handed over to Edgar, who was appointed by the pharaoh Mako as the temporary governor of Spat. Of course, this was only nominal. When the garrison appeared, the streets and alleys suddenly became quiet. The men stopped shouting, the naughty children were chased back home by the women, and the blacksmiths and carpenters hurriedly closed their doors and suspended their business. Soon, only the sound of footsteps and the squeaking of wheels could be heard on the streets. This solemn atmosphere came from tradition, and tradition came from the garrison's sense of ritual. It was easier to gain power than to keep it. Conquering was just a matter of killing and breaking into a fortress, but keeping power was never that simple. Appearance was very important. People wanted their protectors to be brave, strong, serious, and decent. For 50 years, the Santos and Glow families, who managed the garrison of Spat, knew this very well. They were happy to let the garrison show what they wanted to see to strengthen their authority. As the garrison marched forward, they finally stopped in front of Edgar's mansion. There were 30 centurions in charge of the garrison. They had received orders from the head of the Santos family. Yes, it was Santos and not Naman, who was disguised as Santos. After the riot at the trading port last night, the contract demon followed the clues and found the workshop of the House of Bountiful Treasures and rescued Santos, who had been imprisoned for many days. After being released from the Iron Prisoner statue, Santos was given a mission that he was very willing to accept, to lead the garrison to clean up the chaos caused by the demons in Spat. Surround this depraved place. Santos was riding an adult sand rhino covered in plate armor. He himself was the rider of this giant beast this time. Being defeated by the demon Altoros did not make him feel defeated. What really made him feel unbearable was the torture of being imprisoned in the Iron Prisoner statue for the next few days. Helplessness, despair, frustration, and powerlessness. However, these emotions were long gone. After being rescued, the scale of perpetual order immediately provided him with the opportunity to take revenge. I'm going to take that bastard's head with my own hands. Santos roared at the top of his lungs in his heart. However, he did not show it on his face. Of course, this might have something to do with the fact that he was wearing a full set of heavy Mad Knight armor, and his face was completely covered by a helmet. And now he had to do it step by step. After all, Spat was the city that Lord Keys had entrusted to him to govern. Even if it was for revenge, he could not bury the whole city. Every 15 yards, insert a totem pole into the ground. I'll only give you half an hourglass to do this work. Santos's order quickly reached the ears of every centurion through the radio transmission machine. They immediately acted, racing against time to let the garrison soldiers unload the totem poles made of obsidian, which were as thick as a bowl and as tall as a person, from the carts they had pulled. These totem poles were all the latest products provided by the scale of perpetual order. Although the core mechanism of operation was still the spells of the elemental shamans of the island world, the totem poles were no longer made of ordinary hardwood. The researchers of the scale of perpetual order had improved the totem poles in the ash world. They used spells in the spell factory to directly shape the obsidian and then created this new product. Because there were no gods in the ash world, the souls of mortals could not ascend to the god's kingdom after death. This batch of obsidian totem poles had been nurtured in various places for more than 10 years and had absorbed enough soul power. They were like super large obsidian magic beads, each of which was enough for spellcasters to cast dozens or even hundreds of low-level spells. According to the Chamber of Commerce, the total energy contained in the totem poles that Santos had transferred was enough to support the normal operation of a large floating city for a month. But now it was just to trap Altoros for a day. With the energy contained in the totem poles, it was naturally no problem. In particular, Santos had received definite news from Lord Naman that Altoros, named Golik, was temporarily unable to enter Edgar's mansion due to the order of his mistress. These totem poles were a safety measure. Set up Hellscream. Target Edgar's mansion. Fire at will. After the totem poles were set up, Santos immediately gave the real order to attack. Hundreds of cannons, which had been adjusted to various elements, began to fiercely bombard Edgar's mansion complex. The fist-sized cannonballs were splashed to every corner of the mansion as if they were free. The obsidian totem poles were also activated. Pale green light rippled from them and enveloped Edgar's mansion. The explosions caused by the rain of cannonballs did not spread out of this layer of boundary. After half an hourglass, when the cannons had to stop firing because of overheating, Santos looked at the battlefield that was about to be razed to the ground with satisfaction. Although he was very clear that Altoros, Golik, was not dead yet, was this not just the beginning? After the meeting gift, there is still a benevolent heart waiting for you. Santos waved his hand, and a group of spellcasters in black robes escorted many shabbily dressed people in yellow robes over. Send them in, Santos ordered. At the same time, he said in his heart, let's put on a good show of dog biting dog. Chapter 900. Wearing dark brown, hooded robes mixed with yellow and dirty animal fur, under the escort of the black-robed combat mages of the Spat City garrison, a group of people staggered into the smoke-filled battlefield. Behind them were soldiers pulling a flatbed cart. The flatbed cart was full of bloody animal corpses, attracting a lot of flies. Take a step back and die. The black-robed combat mage leading the team said coldly. At the same time, the guy with an eye patch and only one intact, I pulled off the hood of the strongest prisoner, revealing the jackal-like head inside. The other party stared at the one-eyed man fiercely, but the one-eyed man was not afraid of his beast-like gaze at all. You should be grateful. After all, the thing your master has been looking for more than 100 years is hidden here. After saying this, the one-eyed man smiled and quickly retreated to the main camp with the black-robed mages. He was not a black-robed combat mage of the garrison, but was temporarily transferred from the scale of perpetual order by Naman to help. Without a powerful spellcaster, the contract demon did not dare to let the spellcasters of Spat City escort the slaves that the Chamber of Commerce had obtained in the War of Other Dimensions. After all, Although the Flinder Knoll priests could not use divine spells normally in the Ash world, if they attacked unexpectedly, it would not be a problem for them to tear the necks of ordinary black-robed mages. Even if the Chamber of Commerce had a large business, it would be better to avoid such meaningless losses as much as possible. What's more, these Flinder Knoll priests could still be of special use now. The word master only meant one existence for the Flinder Knolls, and that was the Lord of the Abyss, Yeenoghu, known as the King of the Knolls. And being able to become priests also meant that they were all quick-witted among the Flinder Knolls. Therefore, they all quickly realized what Yeenoghu had been looking for more than 100 years. The ancient Knoll god. The leading Flinder Knoll priest suddenly turned his head, narrowed his eyes, and sniffed, carefully sensing the smell in the depths of Edgar's mansion. Even though the smoke here did affect him a little, that faintly discernible familiar smell made his mind tremble. As expected, Golalic was hiding here. His heart burst with vitality, blood rushed into his eyes, and both of his eyes turned scarlet. Prepare for the ceremony. Quick, quick, prepare to link to the assembly gate. He shouted at the other Flinder Knoll priests, two hot breaths coming out of his nostrils. Although he knew very well that the scales of Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce that brought them to Gol-Alik and provided offerings most likely had bad intentions, he couldn't care less after smelling the aura of Gol-Alik, the dejected deity. Even if this is a trap, he thought to himself. In the end, it's still up to the great king of Jackalands to decide. Yeenoghu's must give the order. But we have to report the situation now. Whether it is for the sake of the priest's duty or for the purpose of saving ourselves, this is the only thing we can do now. Thinking of this, the Flinder Knoll priest made up his mind and immediately bit the vein on his arm with his canine teeth. Dirty blood surged out and splashed on the ground, splashing up clouds of dust. Seeing this, the other priests immediately began to follow his actions. They were now holding a summoning ritual. Although there were flesh and blood sacrifices, they still lacked a broken stone altar. Therefore, they could only use their own blood to pollute the land and temporarily create a magic circle that could establish a connection with the bottomless abyss. To be honest, this method was a bit old-fashioned, but it was simple and convenient. When the blood of the Knoll priest was sprinkled, a handful of yellow soil absorbed the dirty blood and immediately exuded a foul and depraved aura. Like a miasma, the blood mist enveloped all the Flinder Knoll priests. They all became crazy. While loudly chanting poems praising Yeenoghu in Knoll language, they chewed the meat and offal of the animals used as sacrifices for the ritual. Strangely enough, a dozen Flinder Knolls ate more than half of the food in the cart, but their bodies seemed to have become much thinner. It was as if not only the food that was swallowed into their stomachs was quickly digested for some unknown reason, but even their bones and flesh were also digested. Instead, it was the blood mist that was getting thicker and thicker. When the first Flinder Knoll priest could not hold on and collapsed on the ground, he was immediately eaten by the other Knolls. In the end, the remaining survivors were all high-ranking Flinder Knoll priests who decisively used their dirty blood to build the altar at the beginning. The blood feast is over, the gate of assembly open. Chewing a thigh of his own kind and quickly swallowing it deep into his throat, the leader of the Flinder Knoll priests, who was originally the strongest, howled loudly. At this time, his body had shrunk by a third compared to before. The yellow-brown robe on his body had all been dyed red with blood, and his fur had also grown white patches. However, he knew very well that he had made the right bet. Creak, 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 creak. A huge circular arch door appeared in the blood mist. This was the gate of assembly that the Flinder Knoll priest had been longing for. This was a large two-way portal located in the center of the silent prairie on the 422nd floor of the abyss. It could allow Yeenoghu to go to many known planes. It was said that this gate of assembly was not created by Yeenoghu. It was not even the masterpiece of his predecessor, the powerful fallen Angel Azar, or the former demon lord, the Storm King Obilus Demon Backhard. It was the treasure left behind by the terrible, powerful, an incomprehensible god-slayer, Ma Yuan, who is now, fortunately, for many gods and demon lords, imprisoned in the Well of Darkness and could only torture those prisoners in the Well of Darkness. That's right, God-slayer, a special name for the existence that could destroy the divine kingdom and slaughter the true gods. If one counted carefully, that Ma Yuan should be considered Qi's predecessor. Except for the time of troubles, the only mortals in the multiverse who had really killed the gods were Qis and Ma Yuan. Years ago, Ma Yuan walked out of the gate of assembly and stabbed Azar, the demon lord of the 422nd floor of the Abyss, to death. He also completely changed the desert terrain of this floor of the Abyss, which had been expanding nonstop. Watered by Azar's blood, the 422nd floor of the Abyss turned from a desert into a silent prairie. The Flinder Knolls had just settled here, and Yinagu was also a rising demon lord in this environment. However, not long after killing Azar, Ma Yuan was imprisoned in the Well of Darkness. The Gate of Assembly was left on the 422nd floor of the Abyss, and Yinagu later picked it up. After several studies, Yinagu figured out some ways to use this treasure and became one of the few demon lords who could communicate with the material plane. It was precisely because of this convenience that he was able to slowly subdue most of the gnolls living in various material planes and replace the ancient gnoll god Golik as the new gnoll god. Chapter 901. Who Calls Me? The gate of assembly opened, and a gnoll about 6 feet tall, not very strong, even slightly thin, walked out of the huge gate. The great poisonous beast, the lord of the gnolls of all planes, the only true god of the gnolls, his majesty Yinagu. All the Flindian gnoll priests present were lying on the ground, tears and saliva flowing down their cheeks. They were chanting Yinagu's poem in gnoll language. After passing through the gate of assembly, when Yinagu stabilized his body and adapted to the world of ashes, he immediately understood what the Flindian gnoll priests were thinking. So that's how it is, that's how it is, that's how it is. No wonder you were in a hurry to hold the blood feast ceremony. Very good, very well done. You should be rewarded and praised. Yinagu's voice was like the sound of rubbing glass with his fingers. Just hearing it could make people feel irritated and uneasy. But in the ears of the Flindian gnoll priests, the words of this existence just now were no less than the sound of nature. They soon found that the health they lost in the blood feast ceremony was recovered at an abnormal speed. Not only that, but their bodies were also like inflated balloons, swelling more and more. Each of them grew into a monster like a small giant. Even the Emperor of the Mortals will not send hungry soldiers to war. Standing in front of the gate of assembly, Yinagu smiled. He rubbed the fur on his face with the 3-headed flail in his hand, making a sound like a porcupine rubbing thorn beans. But some old stubborn people don't know this even when they are about to die. Yinagu suddenly turned around and let out a mournful roar towards the depths of Edgar's mansion. He loves his hyenas far more than his real people, so he will be abandoned by his people and eaten up. No wonder I couldn't find you all these years. It turns out that you hid in this plane abandoned by the gods. You are too naive. Do you think this can stop me? When I, Yinagu, rose in the dark prairie, I didn't rely on divine power. Jackalan's the hunt begins. With Yinagu's roar, groups of Flinder's gnolls suddenly appeared in the shadow of the gathering gate. All of them were tall and strong, fully equipped with armor and weapons. Hearing their master's order, they immediately rushed out of the gate of assembly like a flood and ran towards the depths of Edgar's mansion, which had already turned into ruins. Over there, a foul aura instantly rose. As the rubble shook, a gigantic monster with the head of a hyena-toothed beast for arms, and every palm transformed into a hyena-toothed beast's head instantly stood up straight and howled at the sky. You damn traitors! Back then, I was the one who taught you how to tame hyenas for hunting. I was the one who led your weak ancestors through all obstacles. I was the one who introduced language to your civilization. You actually betrayed your oath and submitted to a demon lord. Fine, fine. Today's matter ends today. Today, I will draw a clean line with you. I will become your nightmare." Before Joel Lek finished speaking, Yennegu's avatar instantly appeared beside him. Long-winded old man. The king of gnolls let out a deafening roar. His voice was somewhat inconsistent with his ordinary figure. "You have given up your identity and transformed into a Yugoloth, and you still talk about the treachery of the gnolls? Weak is weak. There is no need to talk nonsense." Before he finished speaking, Yennegu's three-headed flail hit Joel Lek's ankle. This weapon was a divine artifact of Yennegu. As long as it hit the target, no matter how many flail heads hit it, it could deal all the damage. Moreover, as the number of flail heads hit increased, the injured person also needed to be immune to three kinds of effects in succession: confusion, paralysis, and instant death. If the immunity failed, the injured person would fall into negative effects. All three flail heads hit. It could be seen that Yennegu had used all his strength since the beginning. He was bent on killing Joel Lek, the ancient Gnoll god. And his long speech, just now, was nothing more than trying to disturb the opponent's mind. The purpose of commanding the Flinders Gnolls to launch a hunting charge was also the same. One had to admit that those who could survive in the bottomless abyss were all ruthless. However, the current Joel Lek had at least transformed into an Altoros demon. He was no longer the poor demon who was on the verge of being extinguished at any time. After being hit by the instant death effect of the three-headed flail, although the monster was sent flying with a roar, he was successfully immune. Plague, rabies. In the air, Joel Lek immediately activated the new talent he had obtained after transforming into an Altoros demon. This was a skill that every Altoros demon had. They could choose to become the representative of a plague. Epidemics such as anthrax, plague, typhoid, and so on had been taken over by the powerful Altoros demons. The plague that Joel Lek chose for himself was a plague called rabies. As soon as it was activated, the pathogenic factors that had been arranged long ago were immediately activated. Except for Yennegu, the god's incarnation, and a small number of Flinders gnolls with excellent physiques, most of the gnolls immediately foamed at the mouth, acted crazily, and attacked their companions without any explanation. Some of the infected jack-o'-lanterns even ran out of Edgar's mansion. As long as they spread the plague to spat through their bites, Golik's power would increase rapidly, and the city would turn into a cannibalistic ghost town. However, Santos, or the Scale of Perpetual Order, had long been on guard against Joel Lek's move. Since he already knew the identity of Joel Lek, how could he not make some preparations in advance? Adjust the obsidian totem pole, Santos ordered decisively. At the same time, the black-robed combat mages in the garrison of Spat immediately began to chant spells. They quickly mobilized the magic power stored in the obsidian totem pole, and on the basis of strengthening the defensive enchantment, they summoned a new layer of barrier composed entirely of clear water. Those Flinders gnolls who were infected with rabies were either bounced off by the force field of the defensive enchantment, or let out a howl of horror when they touched the clear water and retreated on their own. Those guys were prepared. Yennegu's incarnation noticed this. He began to wonder if Joel Lek in front of him would collude with the humans of this material plane. However, he immediately made up his mind. Whether they have any tricks or not, this old thing must die here today. Thinking of this, Yennegu immediately let out a long howl. Those Flinders gnolls who had already begun to fight with each other suddenly stopped. Since you want to see the violent gnolls, I'll show you what I can do. As a god, Yennegu's clergy was not only gnoll, but also demon, evil, and berserk. Although it was somewhat difficult to use divine power in the Ash world, it was not a problem for him to personally use some divine power in his own clergy. Yennegu waved his three-headed flail and split the air with a swoosh. Those Flinders gnolls who had just been roared by him immediately swelled up. Their pupils gradually dilated, leaving only a blood spot in their eyeballs, and the rest were all white. Then, these guys completely abandoned their rationality, lay on the ground, and rushed towards Joel Lek like real jackals and wolves. Yennegu used the power of Berserk to suppress the effect of rabies. Anyway, These infected gnolls had no chance to survive, so he simply used their last bit of value to add some trouble to Gol Lek. Bah, what do you mean by the prosperity of the gnolls? Yinagu, you just use them as tools. Gol Lek cursed loudly. Yinagu just showed an evil grin. What do you know, you old thing who only knows how to *CK and eat shit? Chapter 902. Yinagu, Golik, who was called an old thing, was furious. He stood up straight, his forearms suddenly extended, and his palms in the shape of a hyena's head opened his big mouth full of fangs. He attacked Yinagu from all directions. Bull strength. The king of gnolls did not move. He just stretched out his palm with sharp claws and pushed forward. He did not cast the spell to buff himself, but to provide some help to the 4 helpers he summoned temporarily. They were all Abyss ghouls, the lord of the 421st floor of the Abyss, the king of ghouls, Dorison. Unlike ordinary undead creatures, the Abyss ghouls were half-tower demons that had been transformed by Dorison. Just like their master, they were tall and straight, and they were not hunched like ordinary ghouls. Their eyes were always burning with pale green light, symbolizing the endless hunger in their hearts. Originally, Dorison was one of the demon princes, the undead lord Orcus, but he was later abandoned by his master. Only then did the king of ghouls turn to his neighbor, Yinagu, the lord of the 422nd floor of the Abyss. As his lord, the king of gnolls also had the right to mobilize the Abyss ghouls for his own use. Although most of the time, the Abyss ghouls were not as useful as the most powerful group of Flinder gnolls under his command, but in this case, the battlefield was filled with the pathogenic agent of rabies, so using the Abyss ghouls was undoubtedly a good move. As soon as these tall and strong undead creatures appeared, they quickly understood Yinagu's tactics. They wrapped around Gorlik's arms one by one. After hooking the target with their sharp claws, they stretched their jaws to an exaggerated angle and used all their strength to pierce the skin of the Altoros demon. Countless tiny spells meandered down from their teeth and poured into Gorlik's muscles along the teeth marks. This was called the Abyssal Ghoul's Gnaw. When they were transformed by Dorison, they gained the spell-like talent of the Thanner Re-Demons. Any target bitten by the Gnaw would most likely fall into a state of paralysis, but the duration of the paralysis varied. This talent came about thanks to Dorison's teachings. A real ghoul must love the flesh and blood of living creatures. Living creatures would definitely resist when bitten, so the Abyss Ghoul's Gnaw would evolve into a spell-like talent. And the reason why Yinagu summoned them was because of this ability. As for the other ghouls, as soon as the ghouls bit Golik, Altoros' hand, which had transformed into the head of the hyenas, quickly turned around and bit the ghoul's tailbones. Then, like a pair of scissors, the ghouls were all cut in half. Stupid guy, Yinagu thought. Like an arrow released from a bow, the king of gnolls swung his 3-headed flail and rushed in front of Altoros in a blink of an eye. Gorlik was still paralyzed for a second or two after being bitten by 4 Abyss ghouls. Although he quickly dealt with the undead creatures, he not only missed the best opportunity to attack Yinagu, but also revealed a flaw. Great slash! Almost without pause, after charging, Yinagu slammed the 3-headed flail on Gorlik's head. The hyena Fong Bi's head was raised high up in the air, and many of its teeth were knocked out. Not only that, after completing the blow, Yinagu quickly changed the way he held the 3-headed flail. He stabbed Gorlik's chest with the sharp awl at the end of the flail handle. Few people knew that the Gnoll King was also an extraordinary assassin in addition to having a high barbarian level. Puff! Unsurprisingly, Yinagu pierced Gorlik's body with the 3-headed flail and stabbed it into his heart. Give it to me. The Gnoll King twisted his wrist hard, and the sharp awl at the end of the 3-headed flail handle suddenly bloomed like a flower. The opened fine gold blade twisted Altoros' heart into thousands of pieces. Evil Shadow Strike. In order to prevent Gorlik from counterattacking before his death, Yinagu quickly twisted his body in a circle and pulled out the 3-headed flail inserted in his heart. He backhanded his opponent with an even more ferocious blow. A shrill black mist spurted out from the top of the 3-headed flail. It hit Gorlik's majestic body and smashed Altoros hundreds of steps away. Foul blood gushed out of the hole in his chest. 2 deep ditches were left on the ground by Gorlik's feet as he stomped on the ground. After suffering such a fatal attack, his eyes lost focus for a moment, and his dark yellow pupils contracted. However, even so, Gorlik did not fall. Ah ha ha ha! Gorlik lowered his head and supported himself with his 4 elongated arms on the ground. At first, he was still gasping for breath, but he immediately turned his anger into surprise and laughed wildly. You can't kill me now, ha ha ha. With a burst of wild laughter, a large number of heart fragments immediately spurted out of Gorlik's chest. However, after eliminating these foreign objects, his chest immediately healed. Yeenagu's face froze. The Knoll King did not know that Gorlik, who had fallen to a demigod because of the lack of faith, had an even more incredible ability than his original divine body after transforming into an Altoros demon. He could not be killed for the time being, unless his mistress died. Otherwise, under the effect of the contract, Altoros demon would have a strange immortal characteristic. In other words, the only one who could kill Gorlik now was Snade, who had captured the knight, Ghost Granny Shanka. The reason why the steampunk demigod was not killed was nothing more than the Order of Keys. Far away in the depths of the astral world, the young blue dragon, who was exploring a ruin, hurriedly sent back a message. Set the bait. Lure the dog into the field. 2 dogs fight. Drive the dog to swallow the wolf. I like the gate of assembly very much. It turned out that all of this was a plan made by that existence. Keys had taken a fancy to the treasure that Yeenagu had mastered. What was the reason for this? Chapter 903. This was what happened. A few days ago, in the distant astral world, Keys, who was exploring the Kuobai Belt, encountered a large group of Slavic toads. The young blue dragon wondered if he had plunged headfirst into Zhu In's territory. Then he thought of the dish spicy bullfrog. He didn't even need to move his hands. He directly mobilized his force field talent to act on all the Slavic toads within sight. With a strong pull of the head and tail, the spine broke with a crack. With a ripping sound, the flesh was torn open. After the ingredients were prepared, the small hammer was summoned by the young blue dragon in high spirits. Although it was somewhat reluctant, in the end, it obediently became a big enough pot. Cooking equipment that contained the mice energy core was destined to be extraordinary. The hammer pot not only had its own heating function, but could also use the Banquet of Heroes spell to create the hot pot base. Gurgling, the butter was boiling. Before putting it into the pot, some picky Keys was still picking and choosing. The Slavic toads were too dirty, so he threw them away. The green toads were too thin, and the meat was too dry. The blue toads and red toad were just right, with enough muscle and meat, fresh and delicious. Cooking the opponent on the battlefield on the spot, there was one more strange story circulating in the multiverse today. Some other Slavic toads that came one after another were shocked by the corpse-strewn hot pot situation of their own kind, and all of them were hesitant to move forward. Until a short and fat toad, grayish-brown skin with sickly green spots, dry and tough, a series of small horns turned backward, gathered into a sharp cone on its skull, appeared in front of Keys. He looked at the hot pot with boiling oil, leaving a pool of saliva, and then looked at the young blue dragon with a puzzled look in his eyes. Which lord are you? Keys used his force field to pick up a large pile of cooked Slavic toads and threw them into his mouth. He chewed while looking at the new, uninvited guest and casually greeted him. Yes, he had already seen that the one standing in front of him was a Slavic lord. They were the closest thing to gods among the Slavic toads. However, these lords were neither gods nor demigods, just like the lords of the abyss and the lords of the nine hells. They were powerful beings who relied on their own strength. The usual habitat of the platoons was the Chaos Sea. As the opposite mirror image of the rigid order of the mechanical realm, the Chaos Sea was a plane of unrestrained chaos. Here, chaos crushed order, randomness replaced predictability, freedom enslaved the rules, and the individual triumphed over the whole. Just like the essence of the Chaos Sea, Strachan was an example of chaotic, neutral behavior in all forms. Due to its nature, slugs were usually intoxicated by the unpredictable chaos. However, true freedom did not exist for the weak slaw red and blue toads because they were often bullied and enslaved by the stronger slaw toads. True freedom only existed for the truly powerful individuals. This was even more obvious on the more powerful green slaw toads, gray toads, and dead toads. Because they had become stronger, they could impose their will on the lower-level slaw toads. When a certain stratus is more free to fulfill its own wishes than the wishes of others, it defines itself as a more powerful class. But as long as a slat toad belonged to a certain class, it would never be a true individual. There were exceptions to everything. Some slaw toads escaped from this structure and drove themselves to explore the essence of chaos. They hoped that the essence of chaos could grant them a unique identity and give them an incredible ability. During this investigation and research, which was an incomprehensible and extremely dangerous process, the slaw toad could leave the same class structure of slaw toads and become a lord of slaw toads, a unique existence filled with power and the will of chaos. In the multiverse, there are 3 things. However, there were 4 lords of slaw toads who had transformed from slaw toads. They were the Mad Overlord Sindam, the Entropy Overlord Igor, the Random Overlord Chuster, and the Color Overlord Riembu. Later, a few unique lords of slaw toads were born in the Chaos Sea. However, they were not as powerful as the first 4. Under normal circumstances, they had to obey the orders of the Entropy Lord Igor. In the eyes of ordinary slaw toads, the first 4 lords of slaw toads were the ones with the right roots. However, there are also unusual situations. For example, this lord of slaw toads, named Walter, was very unusual. The unique characteristics that he had obtained from the essence of chaos were actually bragging and Zu An's words. He, who was unscrupulous in his actions, had publicly insulted the first 4 lords countless times. When he was lucky, the 4 lords did not even bother to pay attention to him. However, the Chaos Sea was full of all kinds of accidents after all. Once again, when Walter was insulting Igor, he happened to meet Igor himself. He had successfully infuriated the Lord of Entropy. Then, the latter kicked him out of the Chaos Sea and kicked him to the Mountain Paradise's plain. In the end, Walter still escaped from Mountain Paradise with his tail between his legs, and he even used the spring and autumn style to modify this accident. Igor did not talk about martial ethics. Why did not dodge? He directly used a super invincible spell to eject me to Mountain Paradise. However, deep in his heart, he was still full of resentment and unwillingness. Walter had sworn that he would find a way to catapult Igor, the Lord of Entropy, into Mountain Paradise once in his life. Next to the hot pot, Walter chewed the spicy slaw toads while bragging about his wonderful idea. You don't know that this place is weird. Walter glanced at the young blue dragon. Your ancestor was originally not a creature of origin from any material plane, but he relied on the treasure in this astral world relic to eject his descendants to various material planes at once, cutting off the civilization created by many snake people, voodoo puppets, and other races. I'm not bragging to you, but if that old bastard Igor hadn't ambushed me and forced me to go to Mountain Paradise, I wouldn't have been able to collect such secret information. You'll never guess what I'm going to do. When I open this relic and get the treasure left by your ancestor, I'll get even with that old bastard Igor as soon as I can. Doesn't he like to kick, eject? I'll have to eject him to Mountain Paradise once. I've calculated the coordinates. The top of Mountain Paradise of the 7 hills of paradise, the brilliant paradise Cronus, is the landing point of that old bastard. Ha ha! It was just a pot of spicy, straightest toads. There wasn't even any other dish, but Walter was talking nonsense as if he had drunk too much. Keys couldn't help but sigh. What secrets does Zuin have? These 2 guys were not mortals. The big pot of spicy straightest toads was quickly finished by them. Walter curled his lips. Why is there so little food? Are you looking down on me, the Lord of Zuin?" He turned his head to look at the other straightest toads standing in the sea of stars, all trembling in fear now. He opened his mouth and was about to order them to jump into the pot to add another dish. However, at this moment, a large amount of greasy mucus. How could Keys not add some special seasoning when he invited the Lord of Straightest Toads to a meal? After all, how could the blue dragon have any good intentions? Suddenly, the mucus gushed out from his mouth like flowing amber, and the mucus instantly wrapped Walter tightly inside. "It's over, another one who doesn't talk about martial ethics." Keys waved his hand, and Hammer, who had received the order, immediately changed back to its original form. However, its size was much larger than before. At least, it had no problem using the hammer face as a paddle to smash Walter, the Lord of Straightest Toads, who was sealed in amber. Bang! With another powerful ejection, the Lord of Straightest Toads, sealed in amber, rushed directly to the periphery of the Kuiper belt like a comet. In the astral world, if there was no external interference, it would continue to fly like this. Looking at Lord Zoo, who was locked in the small black room and sent away, Keys nodded in satisfaction. Then he turned his head to look at the stunned, ordinary Straightest Toads and said in a fierce tone, "Didn't you see that your master has left? Do you want me to send you off personally?" Chapter 904. Spat City, Edgar's Mansion, evening. The garrison troops in charge of the encirclement were eating collectively. They were eating a kind of pie baked from a pit. This kind of food made of flour had a nice wheat fragrance when it was fresh out of the oven. The mutton and onion stuffing inside was also full of juice. More than 3,000 people consumed an average of 2 pies per person. They just stood there and waited for the soldiers in charge of logistics to send the food to them. After standing and eating, they drank a few mouthfuls of water from the kettle they carried with them. Dinner was over. After all, as the garrison troops, they were here to fight and not to eat. Serious business could not be delayed. It's about time for this farce to end. At some point, Naaman had strolled to the center of the garrison with a piece of pie in his hand. He had already taken several bites out of it. Hearing this, Santos, who was in charge of commanding the army, quickly saluted. Naaman swallowed the last bite of pie into his stomach. "You lead the troops to suppress the commotion in Spat City. After this mess is over, you will continue to be the governor of this city. As for other things, you don't have to worry. The Chamber of Commerce has already made arrangements." With that, the contract demon disappeared. In a manor outside Spat City, the steampunk half-lich Snade first looked at the clock hanging on the wall, then turned his head to look at the giant amber in the middle of the room. "Have a safe journey. I won't see you off." Snade controlled the mechanical prosthesis and snapped his fingers. Magic waves immediately spread out from his fingertips, and all the restrictions on the amber seal were activated. Finger of Death, Extreme Melf, Acid Arrow, Soul Destruction. The 3 compound spells were activated one by one. A gray gas emerged from the middle of the amber seal and killed the night hag imprisoned inside. Then, Melf's acid gushed out and turned her lifeless body into a pool of pus. Finally, a black light flashed, and the soul that was about to escape to the lower plane was directly torn into pieces, destroying the body and destroying the soul. The half-lich worked so simply. Golik, who was fighting with Yinagu, suddenly trembled involuntarily. The Altoros demon seemed to have encountered a great terror, and his entire body began to twitch nonstop. His hag mistress was dead. According to the contract, he was about to die, even if he was not an ordinary Altoros demon, which Altoros demon was an ordinary one. Damn it, I still have to die. No, mortals cannot kill gods. Only now did Golalik remember his past identity, and he bellowed in his heart, rejecting the call of death from the multiverse's origins. Of course, except for special circumstances like the time of troubles, it was impossible for ordinary mortals to kill gods. Apart from the Godslayer, only other gods or demigod powers could truly kill a god. Therefore, after Shanka was killed by Snade, Golik was able to resist for a short while. However, in front of him, there was a demon lord and the Knoll god, Yinagu, who saw the sudden change in his old opponent. He could not let go of this opportunity. "Go to hell, old thing destined to be eliminated," the Knoll god roared loudly, swinging his three-headed flail and smashing on the top of Golik's head. Bang, bang, bang. 2 hits. Bang, bang, bang. Like a storm, Yinagu was determined to beat the Altoros demon, and the weapon in his hand did not stop until the body of the Altoros demon was completely smashed into pieces. Because the demons of the lower realm had the body and soul as one, when the body was destroyed into meat paste, Golik's soul was also completely turned into powder. Yinagu howled to the sky, announcing his feat to the entire multiverse. In many primitive material planes, the Knoll tribes who were still secretly worshipping the ancient Knoll god all fell into a state of madness. They could not communicate normally. They just looked at the priests who worshipped Golik and drooled. "There are 2 more guys," Yinagu thought as he stood in the ruins, wiping the flesh stains on the 3-headed flail with his palm. Golik was dead. In the entire multiverse, except for the other 2 Knolls, there were no other Knolls who could share the honor of being the Knoll god. However, those 2 had now turned to the god of tyranny ban. With Yinagu's strength, he was not strong enough to challenge the 2 traitors who were protected by the powerful gods. "I have to become stronger." The Knoll King's nose twitched, and his mind quickly became active. "Since I'm already here, why don't I make more money?" He began to have ideas about the Ash world. Although this material plane was remote, there was no god to take care of it. When he entered through the gate of assembly, Yinagu felt this. This meant that if he worked hard, he might be able to turn this place into a ranch for Knolls, and other intelligent humanoid creatures would become the prey of the Knolls. The strength of the Knoll god was inseparable from the reproduction and prosperity of the race. Although Yinagu had many Flinders Knolls in the Abyss was not a habitable plane. Even with his care, the Flinders Knolls still struggled to survive. In other material planes, due to their nature, it was difficult for the bloodthirsty Knolls to form a climate. Most of the time, the Knolls could only be reduced to monsters in the wilderness of many countries. They could not reach a broader stage at all. There are a lot of people in this city. As a god, Yinagu's perception was naturally extraordinary. Even with the barrier of the magic circle, he could still feel the vitality of Spat City. The gate of assembly has been opened. I might as well let those little bastards come out to play and see if I can get some benefits. Just as he was thinking about this, all the obsidian totem poles around Edgar's mansion suddenly burst out with powerful magic fluctuations. All of a sudden, they released all of their magic energy and directly teleported the ruined mansion to the desert more than 500 paresin to the north. "How dare you?" Yinagu suddenly became furious. He immediately stabilized the gate of assembly behind him, and then gave orders to the Flinders Knolls waiting behind the gate. "Come to this ownerless material plane. Let's have a killing spree." However, Yinagu's words suddenly stopped. He felt that in the east of him, there was an incredible power of kindness rising into the sky like a sharp sword hanging high in the sky. Jason, the paladin who was in charge of Nome, stood straight on the city wall of Nome City. In the west, there was also a terrifying and obscure aura of Megalosaurus, mixed with darkness and holiness. The clockwork Megalosaurus, led by the souls of 5 legendary Megalosaurus and dozens of younger Megalosaurus as auxiliary, raised its head on the top of the Thunder Cliff in the territory of the Dragon Clan. In the south, just near the city where he had just been transferred, a figure as tall as a mountain suddenly stood up. The Knoll King was hesitant. However, after all, he was not a god who took conspiracy and trickery as his clergy. In addition, the Knolls themselves were creatures who gave up their greed and obsession. "So, attack the north. Those humans are all your prey. Go and enjoy the joy of eating flesh and blood. My people, and my allies." He also kept an eye out. Chapter 905. Yinagu wanted to eat meat, but he was not going to leave his ally, Dorison, the Ghoul King, behind. Similarly, the King of Knolls felt that if he was beaten, he had to drag Dorison down with him. There is no need to describe the process in detail. In short, the army summoned by the Jackalan king from the Gate of Assembly had many ghouls from the White Kingdom assisting in the battle. In addition, there were also a small number of zombies disguised as Aardwolves and mixed in with the gnolls. Inigo did not care about these ghouls, who were either helpers or simply here to join the fun. Anyway, he had arrived at a new material plane, so he had to completely relax his body and mind. The smell of living people is the most fascinating. Inigo took a deep breath of the air floating from afar. He twisted his body, which was a little sore because of the long fight, and then looked at the land he was about to wreak havoc with interest. Most of the terrain of the Medici Empire was a continuous desert, but it was a living material plane after all. Compared to the silent prairie full of razor vines and dodder that were as sharp as knives, the cursed peak covered in white bones, and the seeping forest full of disgusting mucus, this place was as comfortable as heaven. Of course, due to the opening of the Gate of Assembly and the influx of demonized gnolls and undead creatures, the paradise gradually changed. In the Nero River, which flowed northward, the fish began to become uncontrollably restless. Some fish even began to show signs of going berserk, attacking merchant ships and fishing boats on the river. In some oases, some springs were tightly sealed by silt, and some water quality began to inexplicably deteriorate. In many areas, the crime rate greatly increased overnight. The bandits seemed to have eaten the heart of a leopard and eaten the guts of a leopard. That night, many strange phenomena suddenly occurred in Bite City, the capital of the Medici Empire. First, some animals such as cats, dogs, snakes, rats, and so on began to disturb humans for no reason. Then, the big bazaar in the city was ignited by someone. In the end, it took the merchants and guards a lot of effort to put out the fire. It was not over yet. In the middle of the night, the garrison took Pharaoh and Mako's decree to arrest the city. They said that thieves had gathered and looted several ships of silver and other goods that Khedive had transported from overseas and had just been transported to the dock. At night, Pharaoh's audience room was brightly lit. Sitting on the throne under the crystal dome, Marco stared at the ministers standing in the room, trembling in fear. He did not say a word. Why are there so many strange things happening today? The young pharaoh fell into deep thought. In the morning, I did receive a secret report from the spy in Spat. Santos ordered the city garrison troops to attack the current acting governor and surrounded his mansion. But the news that came back did not mention anything else. Almost instinctively, the king of Medici suspected that the Megalosaurus Pasha Keys was behind all this. However, although his spies were all experts inherited from the Great Dimensionals Intelligence Unit, they still couldn't see through the smokescreen that the scales of the Eternal Order Merchant Guild had created using the obsidian totem pole. The news that came back did not mention anything about the battle between Inigo, the king of gnolls, and Golik. After all, those spies did not see these things. Therefore, Pharaoh and Mako did not know that the threat of the demons was imminent. Just as he was about to ask more questions, one of the few attendants who had been waiting outside the meeting room hurriedly ran in. This person was so anxious that he did not pay attention to etiquette at all. He directly brought in a senior mage in a black robe. Mako recognized this person because he was also one of the members of the Obsidian Council. "Your Majesty." The black-robed mage held a magic staff in his hand. This was a magic staff carved out of jujube wood. It looked more like a work of art than a magic tool. The only permanent spell inside was Flash, which was the only spell in it. Of course, if not, this person would not have been able to walk less than 5 yards away from Mako with this staff. "Look." Seeing Mako's puzzled face, the black-robed mage immediately activated the flash on the staff. The staff, which was supposed to emit a cold brilliance like the bright moonlight, now spewed out a thick smoke and then flashed a strange green light. Seeing this strange situation, Mako could not help but show a hesitant look. What's going on? Although he and his father had taken the power to use magic from the Great Dimensional Intelligence Unit, after all, the inheritance was not enough, and there was a certain gap in knowledge. Therefore, He did not immediately see through the deeper meaning of the Obsidian Council member. I've already examined it. It's not just this flash staff. All of my magic items are abnormal. Moreover, before meeting Your Majesty, I also communicated with the other members of the council and found that I am not the only one with a problem. Seeing that Ma Ko still did not understand, the black-robed mage could only directly point it out. Magic items are abnormal, plus all kinds of strange things happen in Bite City tonight. We suspect that a powerful demon from the abyss has set foot in the Ash World, and it is even very likely that it is hiding near the capital, thus causing all kinds of incidents. The young pharaoh stood up. When his father, Ascender, and the Great Dimensional Intelligence Unit were still alive, there was a demon invasion in Bite City. According to the records, it was a powerful demon with the status of an abyss lord that set foot in the capital of the Medici Empire. Fortunately, at that time, not only did the Great Dimensional Intelligence Unit and the Megalosaurus Pasha turn the tide, but the demon leader did not bring too many Tana-Reed demons, which saved Bite City from being massacred. At that time, the Black Robe Mages also recorded some magic items and anomalies that appeared among the people, but it was far less than today. Is there an invasion of demons stronger than the Abyss Lord? Ma Ko pondered in his heart, but he immediately rejected this idea. The demons of the Abyss are evil, but the Abyss Lord is almost the ceiling of the demon race. The anomalies that have appeared now are more complicated than the last time. The biggest possibility is that the number of demons coming this time is a little. No, a little, definitely large. Just as he came to this conclusion, another attendant hurriedly ran into the audience room. He ran 2 steps, bent his knees, and slid to the ground, holding a red box high above his head with both hands. Ma Ko focused his mind and waved his hand to cast a spell to summon the red box into his hand. After opening it, he took out a piece of papyrus. Urgent news. The demon army raided the city of Khalil Khedive, broke the city gate, and many people died. The demon army went all the way north and will arrive at Bite tomorrow. Chapter 906. It was drizzling, and the trees were covered with white frost. As soon as the first rays of the morning sun appeared, the cold rain fell from the sky, and the white frost hung on the treetops like foot-long cotton. After a night of turmoil, the citizens of Bite City were about to start a new day, but they were forced to go home by the sudden rain. Few people were willing to go out in the rain and the cold. It was no wonder. After years of operation, as the capital of the Medici Empire, this city had absorbed the wealth of the entire Ashes world. Even the ordinary citizens had enough money at home, so they naturally cherished their lives. However, not long after dawn, the streets were filled with the sound of footsteps of the army, which was even more intensive and urgent than the soldiers searching for bandits in the city last night. Something big is going to happen. Many of the city's residents, who were at home, had the same thought. The fact was similar to what they had thought. Not only the soldiers responsible for the city's security, but also several imperial guards directly under Pharaoh had all received the latest orders from the king early this morning. They were ordered to wear full armor and carry all kinds of light and heavy weapons to take over the defense of the entire Bite City. Many soldiers had just walked up to the top of the city wall when they saw the bloody heads hanging in the net cages in front of the city gate. Those heads belonged to the bandits caught by the soldiers yesterday. They were beheaded without trial. Although Medic didn't say that severe punishment is needed in troubled times, they all realized the seriousness of the situation. As for the officers above the rank of Centurion, as well as the nobles above Aya and Leva and the soldiers, they already knew that they were about to face the demons from the abyss. However, compared to the last demon invasion recorded in the ancient books, the situation this time might be slightly better. Although more demons appeared this time, they didn't attack directly in Bite City. They had the towering city wall to rely on. It was much better to defend the city than to encounter the demons in the streets. At least, those senior officers felt that as long as the soldiers fought with their lives, they wouldn't lose their lives in the battle. With Medica's national strength, as long as they could defend Bite City, It wouldn't be long before the Pasha and Khedive would send reinforcements to wipe out those demons. Although this battle was dangerous, it was also an excellent opportunity to gain achievements and gain merits. The only thing they had to pay attention to was that they had to keep those demons outside the city. They couldn't let even a single one of them enter the city. According to the reports from the front lines, the demons had already breached several cities under Khalil Khedive's control. Not only had they killed countless people, but they had also used various evil secret techniques to strengthen their own forces. Those small towns were fine, but if they massacred Bite, a city with a population of nearly 1 million, things would get out of hand. Soldiers, now is the time for us to put our lives on the line. Do you have wives and children living in the city? Monsters die when they're killed. There's nothing strange about that. Do you know what kind of martial arts are the most powerful? Let me tell you, you will be hacked to death, shot to death by arrows, stabbed to death by spears. Listen up, if I step down from the city wall, you can all kill me. But if I don't, and you do, humph. The officers who had received the message and were sharpening their weapons were all boosting the morale of their soldiers in their own ways. Apart from anything else, those people who were in charge of the military were definitely good at manipulating people's minds. Also, with the war coming, every general reiterated the reward and punishment system again and again. After a while, the 100,000 soldiers who knew that they were about to face the demons from the abyss gradually lost their initial timidity. Of course, the mobilization before the war was not as simple as giving them a boost of confidence. The preparation of weapons and armaments was also the most important thing. Thankfully, as the capital of the Medici Empire, Bite City had never been short of supplies. Armor, sabers, crossbows, flintlocks, heavy cannons, and all kinds of ammunition. Even if all of them were supplied, they wouldn't be used up in half a month. Finally, when Eternal Blaze climbed to the top of the sky and the drizzle stopped, the army made of the demons from the abyss was exposed on the horizon. Some officers had already observed the army through the black-robed sorcerers who followed the army with eagle eyes. However, when they saw the enemy's true appearance, they all had a trace of doubt. Isn't it just a bunch of jack-o'-lanterns? Even if there are more of them, they don't look like demons at all. As officers, they must have seen much more than ordinary people. They wouldn't mistake the common wild monsters for demons. No matter how ferocious those jack-o'-lanterns were, they couldn't defeat an organized army. However, many people thought about it and immediately became extremely cautious. If the invaders were so weak, how did they manage to conquer the cities under Khalil Khedive's rule? Although I saw it with my own eyes, I can't be sure that it's not a trick of the demons. All the officers who became cautious soon benefited from their wise behavior. When they felt the rumbling like an earthquake and saw the throne that was as tall as a city wall and rolled forward on the ground on huge stone pillars, they were not dumbfounded at first. The king of Jack-o'-lanterns sat high on the throne. His descendants forcibly demolished 2 cities for the demon lord. Using dirty blood as the adhesive and stone as the bricks, they built a fortress-like throne. This throne was made in imitation of Yenegu's patrolling palanquin on the dark prairie. It was pulled by the giant skeleton summoned by the spellcasters from the abyss ghouls. It slid forward on the huge stone pillars that were several stories high in diameter. Every time it moved forward, powerful abyss ghouls and flinder jack-o'-lanterns would swarm up to carry the stone pillars and put them in front of the throne again. Looking at the structure at the front of the throne that looked like a ram, the generals in Bite City's garrison gave orders. That's the demon's siege vehicle. Don't let it hit the city wall. Heavy artillery, black-robed sorcerers, aim at the siege vehicle and fire at it. Force it to stop in front of the city wall. Bang, bang, bang. The cannons on the city wall roared. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. All kinds of spells were fired. However, there was no need for Yenegu to do anything. The legion under his command solved the problem for the great god and demon lord. Facing the flying cannonballs, the Flinder Jackalan warriors and the abyss ghouls in front of the throne fell into a state of frenzy. They jumped up and used their bodies to block the cannonballs and spells. Not only was the enemy not stopped, but the towering throne moved faster and faster. Even under the inertia, the mountain-like throne rushed forward and crushed the giant skeletons that were pulling it into powder. It crashed straight into the city wall of Bite City. In just one move, a huge gap appeared in the city wall of the Medici Empire. Bite City was in danger. Chapter 907. Bite City, Big Bazaar. In the Medici Empire, except for the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha Keys, the capital of Bite City was the center of wealth. The power center of this center was the Big Bazaar, which occupied 11 blocks. It was located in the northeast of the city, adjacent to the trading wharf of the Golden Horn Bay, and connected to the east gate of the city, which was specially used for caravans. Merchants would come here every day, and there was an endless stream. Tens of thousands of goods could be exchanged here in the blink of an eye. It was not an exaggeration to say that even a beggar who wandered around the Grand Bazaar, if he was a little more quick-witted, discerning, nimble, and diligent, might be able to seize some rare opportunity and become a rich man in a few days. Here, large amounts of trade could be found everywhere, and the huge profits naturally led to a great enthusiasm for consumption. Drinking pheasants, drinking wine, living with ladies in hostels. As long as one's pocket was full enough, all kinds of enjoyment and entertainment could be at one's fingertips. Of course, for ordinary people, the so-called pocket money mostly referred to silver Kate. After all, gold was too precious, and the outflow of gold drogos from the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha was limited. The purchasing power of copper gnats was not high, and it was very inconvenient to carry a large amount of money. Therefore, silver Kate was the wealth of ordinary rich people. There seems to be something happening in Bite City today. In a blacksmith workshop near the Big Bazaar, a blacksmith glanced at a merchant dressed in the outer islands in front of him and asked meaningfully, "It's none of your business," the merchant said coldly, twirling the pearl handle in his hand. "My lord said that you only need to do your own thing and don't worry about other things." Seeing that the blacksmith was still hesitating, the merchant knew that he indeed needed his help, so he could only patiently explain, "It seems that there are traces of demons, and the imperial guards and garrison troops have all been dispatched. With them, those monsters won't be able to cause any trouble. Moreover, the attention of those big shots is now focused on guarding Bite City, so it's convenient for us to do some things next." The blacksmith nodded and added charcoal to the stove to make a fire. Charcoal could burn faster and hotter than wood or coal. Then, he opened an iron box on the operating table. It was brought by the merchant today, and it was filled with silver coins. The blacksmith took out a large clay crucible and buried it in the charcoal fire. The flame burned to the edge of the pot. The temperature of the crucible gradually rose, turning into the color of the red clouds at dawn. The blacksmith mixed the copper that had been cut into cylindrical ingots with the silver Kate of the same weight and poured them into the crucible. He then used the bellows to increase the heat. After the mixture was melted, he used a stirring rod specially made of mountain elm to stir the metal solution evenly. The wood burned in the hot metal, but this would not hinder the subsequent process. Instead, it was a special step. The clay crucible continued to change color and began to turn the bright yellow of the eternal blaze of noonday. The molten metal also turned dark yellow. He lined up 10 clay molds on the workbench. Then, 2 long-handled pliers were used to lift the crucible out of the fire, and the molds were filled with the molten metal. The molds were filled with the same amount of molten metal. It was the first time that the merchant in charge of supervising him had witnessed this process. To be honest, he was a little scared. Counterfeiting silver coins was a very serious crime. Any act of sabotaging the currency system was considered treason against the pharaoh of the Medici Empire. In theory, the lightest punishment for such a crime was amputation, but in practice, the punishment would most likely be the execution of the entire clan. When the metal cooled and hardened in the molds, the blacksmith turned the molds over and ejected the thick copper-silver alloy discs. Then, he hammered each disc, thinning and widening them until each disc was exactly the same size as the circle carved out by the compasses on the workbench. The merchant knew that a single disc like this could make 240 coins without a pattern. The blacksmith took out a cutter exactly equal in diameter to a silver carat and began to cut out the portion of the alloy disc which was equal in diameter to the silver carat. Then, he carefully swept up the remaining pieces. This part of the material contained the profit that he could make. There were 3 heavy iron cylinders on the workbench. 2 of them were stamping molds, with 2 sides of the silver cate issued by Pharaoh and Mako, which the blacksmith had painstakingly carved. The lower one was called the anvil mold, with the king's profile engraved with the words Pharaoh of Medici. The upper one was called the hammer mold, with a pattern of a ship and a fake origin. There was a line of words made by the Mint of Byte City. Last year, the pharaoh had made some changes to the design of the silver coin. He had added a few sails to the design of the ship. This change had increased the difficulty of counterfeiting the currency. This was exactly what the pharaoh had intended. Because of the repeated hammering, the other side of the hammer mold had been shaped like a mushroom. The 3rd iron cylinder was used to check if the upper and lower stamping molds were aligned. It was called the calibration circle. The blacksmith put the blank coin on the anvil mold, put on the calibration circle, and put the hammer mold into the calibration circle so that it was completely in contact with the surface of the blank coin. Then, he aimed the iron hammer at the hammer mold and hit it hard. He took off the hammer mold and removed the calibration circle. Now, the blank metal coin was engraved with the pattern of a ship. Cuthbert used a blunt knife to pry the coin from the anvil mold and turn it over. On the other side of the coin, there was a picture of Pharaoh. The color of the coin was wrong. This alloy coin was brown, not silver. But it was easy to solve this problem. The blacksmith heated the coin in the fire with a pair of pliers and dipped it into a bowl of diluted sulfuric acid. The merchant watched from aside. The sulfuric acid had removed the copper from the surface of the coin, leaving the color of pure silver. The merchant smiled. He reaped the benefits, he thought. Nothing could please him more than to see this. There were 2 things that made him happy: money and power. In fact, they were the same thing. The merchant enjoyed the power to control people, and money gave him this power. He always wanted to have more power and money. He was a merchant, but he also wanted to be a noble. When he became a noble, he would strive to be an important minister under the Khedive. Perhaps he would become a Khedive in the end. When that time came, he still wanted more money and power. Thinking back to the brief glimpse of Pharaoh's golden palace, the merchant's heart burned with passion. But he immediately put away these thoughts, because he knew that if he thought about these things now, it was purely a road to death. But life is like this, he thought. After dinner, I will still be hungry the next morning. Chapter 908. The blacksmith sped up, stuffing the coins into the mold, hammering the mold, picking out the new silver cate, and repeating the whole process like a kitchen made picking out peas. The real coiners, or the workers of the Byte Mint, worked in groups of 3, and each group could produce 700 silver cate in an hour. The blacksmith dipped the brown pennies into sulfuric acid, stopping every few minutes to retrieve the new silver coins from the sulfuric acid. The merchant continued to watch from aside. He was so amazed that he did not realize the passage of time. The most difficult part of this process, he thought with a bitter smile, is actually spending the money. Because copper was not as heavy as silver, counterfeit coins could not be used for large transactions that required the coins to be weighed. But he would use the pennies made by the blacksmith in taverns, brothels, and gambling houses. He enjoyed the free time to squander money there, and, at the same time, he could obtain useful information for the Lord. Although the place was filthy, there was a lot of useful information. For example, the demon invasion that had just happened last night, and the massacre in Khalil Khedive's territory, which was often at odds with Zagankhadive. Pharaoh and Mako had just learned about it, but the news had already begun to spread among the merchants in the Grand Bazaar. The Lord has ordered all the merchant ships of the outer islands to sail out of the Golden Horn Bay early this morning, and the ship owners will stay for a while outside the bay and wait for a while. I also have to prepare early. If there is a crisis in Byte City, even if I have to give up everything here, I have to go to the dock and take refuge on the fast ship. At that time, the big ships outside the Golden Horn Bay won't wait for me for too long. It's a pity that these shiny silver cate will be wasted. When he was watching the blacksmith lift the molten metal crucible out of the burning charcoal for the second time, his reverie was interrupted by a voice outside the door. "What's wrong?" he whispered angrily. There was one of his servants outside the door. Although he was a servant, he was actually a bodyguard who had once served in the army of Medic. Now his tone was full of shock and fear. The merchant frowned uncomfortably. Then there was the sound of a gunny sack falling to the ground with a thud. Someone kicked the door, causing it to creak. However, since they wanted to get rid of the head business, the blacksmith had naturally reinforced the workshop. "Take this secret passage," the merchant said as he closed the iron box containing the real silver carat on the console. He then looked at the newly pressed copper-silver alloy coins, and a trace of reluctance flashed in his eyes before he quickly regained his composure. "If you want to live, go quickly. Your family has already been taken care of. These things are just a burden to you." Just as they were about to open the secret passage to escape, the secret passage in the workshop was suddenly opened from the inside. A person wrapped in a black robe walked out of the secret passage. Although it was impossible to tell whether the person was male or female due to the hood covering the person's head, judging from the person's figure, the latter was more likely. The merchant pulled out the dagger hidden in his chest. As a merchant who traveled from the south to the north, he used to be a strong warrior, and his hands were stained with blood. "Get out," he threatened. "This is our house. You are trespassing." Without waiting for him to finish his words, the weirdo in the robe was like a leaf blown by the wind, lightly flying to the blacksmith workshop's console. "Don't worry. If you want to report to the authorities or find the garrison, I can help you. But how do you explain the copper that has seeped into the silver, the molds used to counterfeit money, and the brand new coins on the workbench?" Whoosh! The merchant threw out the iron hoops and wooden box in his arms at the strange visitor who was still inspecting the other facilities in the workshop. He also jumped up like an ape and aimed the dagger in his hand at the other party's heart. Not only that, the merchant also shouted at the blacksmith, "If you don't want to die, then die together." His intention was self-evident. However, the person did not care at all. He just tilted his body slightly and dodged the iron box that was thrown at him. Then, he pulled out a sharp machete from his robe. Ka! The machete cut the merchant's wrist. Then, he rushed forward and raised his leg to kick the enemy's heart. In a split second, the merchant from the outer islands, who was not bad at martial arts, was sent flying. "They forced me to do this." Seeing this scene, the blacksmith, who was about to pick up a pair of iron pliers to fight for his life, hurriedly threw the pliers in his hand to the ground. Then his knees gave way and he knelt down. "I just wanted to earn some rent for the shop. After all, it is not easy to make a living in Bite." "Lying dog," the merchant thought to himself as he fell to the ground. "You want this job so badly. You can make a lot of money." Then he heard the strange person who suddenly appeared ask, "How long has the greedy merchant who serves Zagan Khedive forced you to abuse the pharaoh's currency?" 5 years, the blacksmith replied in a low voice. "Well, it has been a long time. Most likely, it was another Khedive's men." Listening to the tone of the strange person and the question, the merchant immediately made the most logical conclusion. Not only did he see the shining silver coins flowing away from him, but he also felt that his dream of being a noble was far away from him. In an instant, he became furious. Then he used his hands to support his body and stood up. His face was red, and there was saliva on his lips, like the white foam on a sick horse's mouth. He screamed and cursed like a madman. Then, ignoring the machete that suddenly appeared on his body, he stuck his hands into the charcoal, picked up the crucible containing the metal mixture, and splashed it at the blacksmith and the strange visitor. "You're asking for it." The stranger hurriedly lifted his robe to block the hot metal liquid. The precious spider silk robe was instantly burned with a big hole, and an indescribable pain came from his calf. Bang! The tension spring was activated, and an arrow dipped in poison shot out from the crossbow, directly killing the crazed merchant. When the drow looked at the blacksmith again, he could only see a corpse with half of its head burned by the molten metal. Damn it! Originally, The drow and many of his companions were ordered to come to Bite City to seize some of Khadiv's private properties during the demon invasion. In order to increase efficiency, they mostly acted alone. Most of the properties had secret passages, which made it convenient for these evil creatures who lived in underground caves all year round. However, this operation, which was supposed to go smoothly, had some unforeseen circumstances. Didn't I cut that guy's tendons and break his ribs? How can he stand up all of a sudden? Strange things kept happening in Bite City today. Chapter 909. When the drow limped out of the hole, a sneer suddenly sounded at the door of the blacksmith workshop. Then, with a crisp ka-chung sound, the iron lock on the door was broken by someone's fingers, and a person walked in with large strides. The seventh one. Naaman looked at the tools scattered on the blacksmith's workbench and calculated in his mind. Almost every Khadiv is secretly sending people to do the same illegal thing, and every den of counterfeiting money will attract a drow. It really is like the old saying of birds of a feather flock together. He took out a leather bag and didn't care about the counterfeit silver coins in good condition. He just put away the ones that were not properly pickled or hammered. As for the rest of the things, the door of the workshop was open, and there was no one in the house, so it wouldn't take long for the thieves to find them. Naaman believed that those thieves could help him keep his tail. After all, he had at least paid for it, hadn't he? After putting away the inferior counterfeit coins, Naaman immediately walked out of the door and disappeared after taking 2 steps. He rushed to Bite City last night with the purpose of surprising the Khadiv and Pharaoh who were plotting against the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha. Just now, the reason why the merchant from the archipelago was able to complete the heroic feat of killing people before he died was actually because of the little help provided by the contract demon, a berserk spell that increased his adrenaline secretion. As for the damage caused by this spell to the body, the dead didn't have to worry about their health. After visiting 7 counterfeiting dens in a row, Naaman collected more than 300 inferior counterfeit silver coins, which weighed more than 2 hasselts, about 15 kilograms. These were the bullets he collected for the following operation, and they were about to be fired. If used well, this thing can not only kill people, but can also destroy an empire. Naaman couldn't help but sigh with emotion as he weighed the leather bag in his hand. Then, he left the blacksmith workshop and walked into the hazy rain again. The city wall collapsed, and stone debris flew everywhere. When Yennegu's throne accelerated and hit the city wall of Bite City, a loud noise was heard within a radius of tens of miles. Houses in several blocks close to the city wall even collapsed. This throne was like a wedge, hammering into the heart of every Bite garrison. Stop those gnolls and ghouls. Don't let them enter the city. A few thousand men, who were originally behind the wall as reserves, were forced to temporarily become the vanguard in contact with the enemy. They were responsible for blocking the groups of monsters pouring in from the passage below Yennegu's throne. The defenders on the city wall had to be divided into 2 groups. One group had to stay on the city wall to prevent the enemy from climbing up the city wall. The other group had to rush down the city wall to support the reserves and resist the first wave of the monster army. The situation was urgent, but fortunately, the Jackalan throne that had collapsed the city wall did not crash into the tower standing behind the city. On the city wall of Bite City, there was a high tower every 200 yards. To prevent different degrees of settlement from tearing the city wall apart, these towers actually did not intersect with the city wall, but stood alone behind the city wall. When defending the city, archers or spellcasters could not only launch attacks from above the city wall, but also assist the defenders on the city wall to resist when the enemy climbed up the city wall. At this time, the city wall was broken, and the 2 towers near the Jackalan throne immediately turned into a bridgehead, forming a shape of a horn. The archers on each floor of the tower fired arrows, and on the top floor of the tower, there were gunmen with flintlocks firing nonstop. In addition to these conventional forces, the spellcasters stationed in these 2 towers were now all trying to mobilize the energy in the obsidian magic beads. However, the 2 sorcerers were only gray-robed sorcerers, and their strength was not as good as the black-robed sorcerers. After chanting for a long time, they only released a quagmire spell and a chain lightning spell. The former was still somewhat useful, and it could more or less hinder the charge of some Flinders, jack-o'-lanterns, and ghouls. As for the chain lightning spell, because many of the troops brought by Yeenagoo were half Tana demons, Tana demons were immune to lightning and poison. The power of the chain lightning spell was limited and could not cause much damage at all. The ones who really played a key role were the crossbowmen and the snipers. Before the 1,000-man reserve team completed their formation and formed a square formation to block the opening, they were the ones who stopped the rapid advance of the Jackalen army. With almost no gaps in their dense shooting, they killed groups of monsters in the quagmire. However, in less than 10 minutes, more than half of the ammunition and crossbows stored in the two towers were consumed. As long as there were ammunition supplies, it was not a problem for the gunmen to continue to pull the trigger, but the strength of the archers could not keep up. When he heard about the situation, the garrison commander immediately sent people to support the two towers. The gunners could only be arranged at the top of the tower. Gunpowder would produce smoke, so the number of gunners could not be increased, but they had to replenish more ammunition. The archers whose arms were sore and unable to draw their bows had to be replaced by people from the nearby towers. In addition, because of the urgency of the situation, several black-robed sorcerers also replaced the two gray-robed sorcerers stationed in the tower. They joined forces to cast spells stone to mud, earth wall, mud to stone. All kinds of earth and wood spells were cast, and they directly built a barbican around the gap opened by the Jackalen throne. And the advantage of the Jackalen army was restrained, and the offensive of the Jackalen army was immediately stopped. When it came to the war of attrition, Bite City, which had been in operation for more than 50 years, showed its strength. They even brought dozens of heavy artillery to defend the city. They surrounded the Jackalen throne and bombarded it nonstop. Yeenagoo did not want to fight in person yet, so he had to temporarily order his men to retreat and form a camp outside Bite City, waiting for the next opportunity to launch a charge. The Flinder gnolls and ghouls, on the other hand, were foraging on the ground. They hunted the humans who appeared outside the city, dug up the corpses in the graves, or simply fed on the dead of their own kind. The atmosphere outside Bite City was foul. The two tower guards, a total of 50 gunmen, and 80 archers who had made outstanding contributions to resist the attack were each rewarded with 3 silver cats, which were distributed on the spot. But who would have thought that this was supposed to be a happy event? But when they received the reward, something strange suddenly happened. Why did you give us fake money? Chapter 9-10. Morale. I'm most afraid that the soldiers will be resentful before the battle. Numan walked into a hotel that had nothing to do with the garrison outside the city. He hung his straw raincoat on the hanger behind the door to wash it. He had just taken a trip and sent out more than 300 inferior counterfeit coins that he had collected in the morning. These copper-silver alloy coins were either missing with the wrong patterns or not properly pickled. In a word, they were all very easy to distinguish. Khadiv's men and drows needed counterfeit coins, so they naturally hoped that the more authentic they were, the better. However, Numan, who was ordered to take chestnuts out of the fire, did the opposite. He needed counterfeit coins that couldn't be more fake, so that those who got the counterfeit coins could recognize them at a glance. After dressing up and walking to the lobby of the hotel, he drank a glass of cider, ate 2 avocados, and had a bowl of barbecue. What he had done before was gradually fermenting. Why did you give us fake money as rewards? Many people questioned directly. They had just faced the army of monsters and escaped death. Now they were as proud as a pot of boiling oil. However, a basin of cold water was poured over their heads. Naturally, they were irritated. The officers who gave the money to the soldiers wanted to refute, but they couldn't open their mouths to refute. Not to mention that there were no brown silver coins in Medic. Some had green copper rust stains on them, and some had only one side printed with handwriting. They couldn't be more fake. The officers of Bite were all nobles. They had learned how to manage people since they were young. Naturally, they could see that the soldiers were beginning to be dissatisfied, and this was no longer a matter of money. Even if they paid the reward out of their own pocket, it was absolutely a taboo to be resentful before a battle. Now, the best way was to kill a few of his quartermaster officers and let the soldiers vent their anger. However, Bite City was different from other places in Medic. Whether it was in the garrison or in the Imperial Guards, the position of quartermaster was always reserved for people sent by great aristocratic families, as it was a lucrative job. Take the quartermaster who was responsible for delivering the bounty to the soldiers as an example. He was actually the youngest son of the second son of the pharaoh, Bela Bey, who was highly regarded by the pharaoh. Even if he was sent here by the family because he was a good-for-nothing, the Bela family would definitely take revenge on the person who gave this order in the future. Just as the officers began to worry, a strange thing happened in Bite City. In a money collection office run by Japanese merchants, dozens of customers who came to deposit money started to quarrel. The reason for their quarrel was very simple. The staff of the bureau found a few to a dozen fake copper and silver coins in the silver coins that they were going to deposit into the vault. According to the rules of the bureau, not only did they have to refuse to accept the counterfeit notes, they also had to fine the depositor 10 times for each counterfeit note. Naturally, those people were not willing to do so. That was why they had a dispute with the Cheen station. Most of them were owners of gambling stalls, taverns, or brothels nearby bazaar. Naturally, they didn't earn as much money as the other rich merchants in the city. It was because the profits offered by this Japanese money collection office were more lucrative than those of the great nobles of Medic and even the pharaoh that they opened a vault here. Since the quarrel had become big, the manager of the money collection office became more cautious. He opened a vault of those people and counted them one by one in front of everyone. As a result, he found that some of the silver coins that they had deposited before were also counterfeit notes. Moreover, according to the rules of the industry, the money collection office had to take out a fixed amount of money from the customer's vault every month. Therefore, there might be more counterfeit notes in the vault of this group of people. However, the counterfeit notes in the vault were actually very well made. If it weren't for the use of measuring instruments and some magic tools to count them carefully, ordinary people wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the counterfeit notes and the silver coins. The reason for this was firstly because those people had started to make a fuss. Secondly, among the coins that they had deposited this time, there were inferior counterfeit coins that could be seen with the naked eye. Obviously, this was also the work of Namen. However, the inferior counterfeit notes that he had collected in the morning were actually not that many. After replacing the ones that were given out as rewards in the barracks, the remaining dozens of counterfeit notes could only be transferred into the wallets of the people who wanted to collect the money collection office's money. But he had his own information channels. He knew that Khedive had arranged people to do this business in Bite City for many years. Most of the counterfeit notes that he had made before had already entered the market or the vaults of some money collection offices. The inferior counterfeit notes that he had obtained were just a few. The real explosion would be the superior counterfeit notes that Khedive had sent people to make. No matter how superior they were still counterfeit notes. Once they were discovered on a large scale, it would definitely lead to a violent storm. If it were in normal times, with the size of Bite City, it might be able to withstand this strong medicine. But at this time, under the threat of the army of the king of Jackals outside the city, if this matter was not handled properly, the throne of Pharaoh and Mako might be shaken. Who made this? Sitting on the throne in the audience hall of the Golden Palace, Pharaoh's face was even gloomier than the cloudy sky outside. In his hand, he was holding a cate of silver mixed with copper and silver that was given to him by the sniffer unit. He stared at the nobles and ministers who were kneeling on the ground. This was the first time that someone in the audience hall reported to the pharaoh by kneeling on the ground instead of bowing. He gritted his teeth and asked word by word. The counterfeit coin in his hand was a high-quality, premium product. Not only was its cut, shape, and color no different from a real coin, but even the patterns and text on both sides of the coin were similar to the real one. Without the report from the sniffer unit or the magic detection equipment provided by the Obsidian Council, Mako felt that he could not distinguish the authenticity of this coin. It was precisely because of this that he was even more annoyed. You know very well. Pharaoh's voice became colder and colder, and the nobles and ministers in the audience shuddered. But I, the ruler of the Medici Empire, just received the news. Tell me, what benefits did the Khedive give you that you can turn a blind eye to this kind of thing? Who should I start with? Bey, how about you take the lead first? Your Majesty, I know I'm guilty. Bey did not refute or explain. When he heard Pharaoh call his name, he immediately admitted his guilt. Before this, I always thought that this kind of currency could not be used in large-scale transactions. Although the Khedive were greedy, their role was irreplaceable, so I let them use this way to accumulate wealth. But today, after a long period of accumulation, I found that there were so many counterfeit notes flowing into the currency system of Medici. What do you think we should do? Pharaoh interrupted him coldly. Chapter 9:11. Bella knew that there were two things that Pharaoh Mako hated the most. First, his subordinates were stupid and could not help him. Second, his subordinates were too smart and could easily figure out his intentions. Therefore, in the face of the question, Lord Bey first pondered for a moment and put on a pondering expression before putting on a hesitant expression that said, "I don't know if I'm right or not," and replied, "There's a saying of priority when doing things. No matter how brilliant a farmer is, he can't grow the same amount of food as the previous year. We have to solve the problem in a chronological order." Mako rested his elbows on the armrest of the throne. He would do this every time when he was deep in thought. Obviously, Bey's words were similar to the countermeasures he had in mind. Of course, as Pharaoh, he would not make a clear statement now. Punishment. Those who commit crimes naturally need to be punished. Otherwise, no one will fear the law in the future. Then, Bey changed the topic. However, the most important problem now is how to deal with the demon army outside the city. Several Khedive have received the message by magic. According to Medica's law, they must send troops to Bite City in person to help the war. Once we exterminate those magical creatures, His Majesty will naturally be free to punish those greedy Khedive. After that, Bella stopped talking. Pharaoh Mako nodded. What you said makes sense. The rumor of Bella is like a kaleidoscope, is indeed true. It can be seen that in this world, there are only wrong names, but no wrong nicknames. Hearing this, Bella's head was almost stuck to the floor tiles. However, although a kaleidoscope is gorgeous, it's still something practical. Attendants, listen to my order, Mako shouted. Several attendants who were on duty outside the audience hall immediately ran in. Go to the barracks and arrest the quartermaster involved. No matter who he is, he can't be lenient. Then, he would send a group of people to the Japanese Immortal Station to seal it up. Tell the public that they're trying to prevent their counterfeit money from entering the market. Finally, urge the 7 Khedive to come to Bite City's rescue. Tell them they don't have to come if they are late. These orders were issued in an orderly manner, with reason and evidence. However, the nobles and ministers present who had a deep understanding of Pharaoh and Mako's characters could all sense the murderous intent in his words. Moreover, having been in the government for many years, they also knew that Pharaoh had wanted to make a move on the Khedive for a long time, but had not been able to find reason. Now the Khedive had delivered a great sin to the Paragon's hands. If this wasn't delivering a pillow when one was sleepy, what was it? In addition, Pharaoh was in charge of the sniffer unit that monitored the whole world. He did not receive any news about the fake case. No matter how these bureaucrats thought about it, they felt that it was possible. At the thought of this, all the nobles and ministers in the audience hall gasped. However, they did not know that Pharaoh and Mako, who were in charge of the sniffer unit, really did not know about the fake case this time. The reason was very simple. There was nothing more than someone stronger and more sophisticated than the sniffer unit who deliberately concealed the truth. Otherwise, how could someone sneak into Bite City in a hurry and just walk around in the morning and wipe out the 7 Khedive's hideouts of making counterfeit money in this city? It was raining heavily and the road was muddy. Zagan Khedive, who had landed in the nearest city to the east of Bite City, personally led his team forward in the rain. Of course, sitting in the palanquin on the back of the sand rhino, he did not experience the wind and rain like the ordinary soldiers. Every window of the palanquin was covered with ruined cloth for concealment. Not to mention the rain and the breeze. Even arrows and bullets could not penetrate the cloth. At this time, this big shot, who was in charge of the military and political power of the overseas islands province, was leaning on a beauty with gray skin. He was reading the urgent report from Bite City while eating the fruit that the beauty had peeled herself. So slippery. Zagan touched the thigh of the beauty and wiped the juice off his fingers. No one knew what he was referring to. Although he was over 80 years old, Zagan's body was still very healthy thanks to various tonics refined by magic. His appearance was no different from that of a middle-aged man in his 40s. However, although he was healthy, he inevitably had a belly like a swimming ring because he had been indulging in pleasure all his life. It was inconvenient to ride a horse, so he could only ride the sand rhino. Pharaoh is urging me again. Zagan scratched his nose with his thick carrot-like fingers, and then wiped his nose on the report that he had just read. Then this spiked document was thrown into a brazier placed in the corner of the palanquin. The flame rose and licked the paper. After a while, it turned into smoke and was discharged through the ventilation pipe of the palanquin. Last night, all the Khedive had received an urgent message from Pharaoh's attendant's office. They had immediately learned that demons from the abyss had invaded Medica. In fact, Zagan had received the news even earlier. Due to the friction between him and Khalil Khedive, he had planted many spies in Khalil Khedive's territory. Naturally, the news of demons massacring the city could not be hidden from his spies. According to the laws of Medica, as a vassal, the Khedive had to personally lead troops to support their country when it was facing an invasion. Considering the urgency of the matter, they could only delay the journey for 2 days at most. If it did not arrive in 2 days, these Khedive would be regarded as rebels. Therefore, when Zagan received the official message from the attendant's office, he, like many other Khedive, could only assemble an army as long as they, as Khedive, arrived first. The rest of the army could follow. He wanted to take the Leviathan airship of the scale of perpetual order to support Bite City from the air as quickly as possible. However, no matter whether it was the archipelago province or the other overseas enclaves, the airships and the mooring towers had all set sail. They could only transport their troops by sea. Zagan's archipelago province was not so bad. Taking the warships with ruined cloth sails and black oil turbines, they set off in the first half of the night and arrived at the coast of Medica the next morning. As for the other Khedive, they would only arrive tonight at the very least. Since there was more time, Zagan did not hurry and ordered the fleet to enter the Golden Horn Bay and dock at the dock of Bite City. Instead, he ordered the army to disembark in a city near the capital and rush to support Bite City by land. He wanted to take advantage of this time to take a good look at the news from Bite City in the last 2 days in case something unexpected happened. After all, there had been a lot of strange things recently. Where did the demons come from? Zagan was lost in thought. Based on the information gathered from several sources, he roughly knew that the group of demons was attacking all the way to the north. However, the central part of Medica was the territory of the Megalosaurus Pasha Keys. Zagan did not think that anyone could threaten that lord. One had to know that compared to normal monsters, Quest was the truly terrifying king of monsters. Chapter 9:12. It was about a dozen paressins to travel to Bite City by land, which was about 100 miles in total. Although Bite City was besieged by the demons and the surrounding area was not peaceful, Zagan had more than 1,000 skilled warriors and more than 20 black-robe mages with him. He believed that ordinary monsters could not pose a threat to his safety. Not being able to take the Leviathan airship has its advantages. At the very least, we have more manpower. Zagan, who was sitting in the palanquin on the back of the sand rhinoceros, didn't stop thinking even though he was enjoying himself. If that young pharaoh really has any ideas with this army in hand, I can at least retreat calmly. When he thought of this, his rat-like eyes flashed with a glimmer of light. The beauty, who was his human cushion, also smiled without saying a word. She picked up a piece of marinated herring meat from the food box and fed it to Zagan. After doing this, She cast a spell to remove the stinky soup from her fingers without leaving a trace. After walking from morning to noon, the continuous drizzle finally stopped, and the speed of the group increased by a few notches. Zagan had already read 7 or 8 urgent reports from Bite City. He knew that the demons of the bottomless abyss had broken into the city with a strange trick. The defenders had risen to block the gap, and the demons were camping outside the city, preparing for the next siege, a series of changes in the war situation. It seems that the strength of His Majesty Mako's Imperial Guard is not to be underestimated. These demons won't be able to take advantage of us. After throwing the reports into the brazier for the umpteenth time and turning them into smoke, Zagan finally made up his mind. He sat up straight, pulled a rope hanging from the top of the palanquin, and pulled it gently. A set of cymbals installed outside the palanquin played. Not long after, 2 auras appeared outside the palanquin. Zagan tidied up his brocade robe, lifted the rune cloth hanging on the door, and walked out of the palanquin. In front of the palanquin, there was a small open space that could only allow 2 or 3 people to stand. 2 warriors in fanatic armor were already standing at the door. "Pass on my order," Zagan said. "Advance quickly. We must reach Bite City in 3 hourglasses." But before he could finish, there was a commotion at the front of the army. "What's going on?" Zagan hesitantly looked into the distance. He saw that some of the soldiers at the front of the formation had already begun to form a defensive formation. "I'm so unlucky. I haven't arrived in Bite City, but have already encountered a monster." However, Zagan's years of experience as a leader prevented him from revealing his emotions. He turned to the 2 warrior leaders and said, "You 2 go deal with the disturbance in front. If a monster attacks, kill it as soon as possible. Then follow my orders." In the palanquin, the drow also sat up straight. As a rare drow desecration priestess, she sensed a familiar aura coming from the road ahead. Is it really a demon from the bottomless abyss? She frowned. I hope it's not that one who has discovered something. The bone whistle sounded, and all the Flinders who were still wandering in the wilderness were startled. Then they quickly bared their fangs and ran towards the place where the whistle sounded while barking in response. This was the clan leader summoning them. The leaders of those clans were either priests of the Knoll god in the clan or direct descendants of Yeenagu many generations later. They knew that the reason why those clan leaders took them through the gate of assembly and came to this world full of yellow sand, but full of vitality, was entirely because of the order given by the great Knoll god yesterday. And now that they were summoned, it meant that the clan leaders had received a new mission. Now it was the time for them to hunt, to fill their stomachs, and recuperate. Those clan leaders would not blow the bone whistle easily. Northwest, the lagoon area. There's a lot of prey, capture freely. When the bone whistle summoned enough gnolls, an unusually tall Flinders gnoll priest publicly read the decree he had just received from the god. After looting the villages around Bite City and obtaining a lot of benefits, the morale of these gnolls had been rekindled, and they were no longer affected by the failure of breaking through the city in the morning. Commanding this group of monsters no different from beasts was both difficult and easy. Without Yeenagu's avatar, so many gnolls gathered together, there would most likely be a large number of tragedies of killing each other. And precisely because their wild nature was difficult to tame, as long as they were motivated by killing and spoils of war, the blow to morale caused by occasional losses on the battlefield would soon pass. It was just a not-so-detailed guide. In addition to the general direction, it did not even clearly state the distance, the number of enemies, and the situation of weapons. But those gnolls who heard the news did not care at all. Like real gnolls, they crouched on the ground on all fours and rushed toward the lagoon area west of Bite City in groups of 3 or 5. This group of half-demonized Flinders gnolls had a far stronger physical recovery ability than their relatives in the material plane. After eating, they had basically rested for a long time. Not only that, most of them also got some brand new weapons and armor when they attacked the security forces of the villages near Bite City. Although they could not be as good as the regular army of Medicus, it was good enough for the gnolls. It was precisely because of this that when they saw the prey, The flame of greed immediately ignited in their hearts. Fully armed steel armor, sharp scimitars, straight spears. Seeing the good stuff on Zagankidive's troops, this group of hungry wolves suddenly became jealous and started drooling. A few strong gnolls, who were lying on the ground and looked quite similar to hyenas, took the initiative to launch a surprise attack on Zagankidive's army. They were all wearing layers of heavy plate armor, some of which were directly pierced into their flesh with steel nails. This group of gnolls were very good hunters in the dark prairie of the bottomless abyss. That was why they had the blessing of the gods cast on them by the priests. Under the attack of the gnolls, the army that had just formed a formation and had not completely stabilized was suddenly torn apart. Many of the weaker gnolls saw the benefits and immediately chose to follow. Some more cunning gnolls chose to attack Zagankidive's army from the left and right wings. Although gnolls were not good at war, their natural hunting instincts made them better than other races in this kind of small-scale battle. Chapter 9:13. A soldier ran up to Zagan's sand rhinoceros. Ignoring the mud that soaked his clothes, he knelt on one knee and reported respectfully to his master. Our vanguard has reached the lagoon and is fighting with a large group of jack-o'-lanterns. The vanguard's commanding officer asked for permission to send reinforcements to wipe out all the enemies. The soldier knelt on the ground, sweat seeping out of his clothes. The content of his report was polished. The commanding officer of the vanguard did not say, "Wipe out all the enemies," but "If we don't send reinforcements, these hundreds of people will die here." However, Zagan was known for his cowardice. If he were to tell the truth, the messenger was truly afraid that the Khedive would turn around and leave, so he hurriedly fled. "Then what are you waiting for? Hurry up and march." Zagan's voice came from the palanquin on the back of the sand rhinoceros. After the battle broke out, Khedive activated the defensive spell on the rune cloth around the palanquin. Now, he was like a turtle hiding in its shell. As long as the battle was not over, he was not going to take a step out of the palanquin. With Khedive's personal order, the army of the Archipelago province began to press forward. Other than the vanguard of 300 people, the remaining 800 or so people followed the formation to protect Zagan's palanquin. They were mainly responsible for escorting supplies and heavy weapons. Naturally, they were slower than the lightly armed vanguard, so they had not encountered the jack-o'-lanterns yet. Most of the soldiers selected from the Archipelago province had received training related to naval warfare. Although they could also fight on land, they did not have a firm grasp of battle formation changes, echelon combinations, and the like. Therefore, the vanguard's formation was broken by a few giant jack-o'-lanterns in steel armor, and they quickly fell into an awkward situation where they had to fight for themselves. However, they did not have enough heavy weapons, and in the chaotic battle with the jack-o'-lanterns that came from the bottomless abyss, they quickly fell into a disadvantage. Fortunately, a messenger rushed out and asked Zagan to send reinforcements. With the support of more flintlocks, heavy ballistas, and heavily armored side troops, a few giant jack-o'-lanterns in steel armor were killed one after another. Only then did the front line stabilize. Zagan's army of more than 1,000 people gathered together and formed a tight circle. Bang, bang, bang. The soldiers aimed their guns and kept pulling the trigger. The bullets from the flintlock gun hit the gnolls one by one. Blood splattered everywhere they touched, and the bullets pierced through their eyes. Huff, huff. Warriors wearing heavy armor and holding scythe-edged swords in both hands were at the outermost perimeter. Whenever a jackhallen tried to rush into the front line and tear open a gap, they were all cut in half and dropped to the ground. Whoosh! The bowstring of the heavy ballista was fired every few seconds. The bolts with a simplified version of the rune, "Defeat the enemy first," were used to kill the giant gnolls under the joint control of the archers and the gray-robed mages. In less than half an hourglass, the jack-o'-lanterns that had surrounded Zagankidive's reinforcements in the lagoon were all dead, leaving behind a trail of corpses. After the battle ended, the army did not stop to rest. They simply collected the corpses of their comrades and handed them over to the mages to be cremated on the spot before setting off again. Why don't you take a break? There's still some time before the deadline to support Bite. We can't. After the battle, Zagan summoned his 3 advisors to present a report. The 2 warriors who were in charge of the 1,000-man army had the same idea as Zagan, but a black-robed mage advisor insisted on moving forward as soon as possible. This situation is not right. Except for a small number of gnolls in the Ash world, the rest of them are Flinder's gnolls that crawled out of the abyss. I've counted that more than 300 of them died in this battle. With the normal clan size of the gnolls, there should be 1 or 2 spellcasters among the gnolls. But during the battle, we didn't find any. There must be something strange going on. Zagan was immediately persuaded by the mage advisor. He also felt that they should not waste too much time in the wild. After all, Bite City was under siege by an army that crawled out of the abyss. There were only a little more than 1,000 people around him. If they really fell into a trap in the wild, they would not even know how they died. It would be safer to rush to Bite City as soon as possible. Give each soldier an alchemy tonic bought from the scale of perpetual order. We'll march quickly and try to reach Bite City within 2 hourglasses, or before dark at the latest, Zagan ordered decisively. Standing on the back of the sand rhino, the Khedive looked around the lagoon. He suddenly remembered the night of the long knives decades ago. It's better to stay away from this place. It's inauspicious. What Zagan did not know was that in addition to him, several other Khedives had also arrived at Medich with reinforcements to support Bite City. Most of them, like Zagan, did not let the fleet sail into Goldenhorn Bay. Instead, they landed at other important ports along the coastline. Then, these Khedive led their troops and marched to Bite City by land. Moreover, these people's troops were also ambushed by Jackalans on the way. Unlike Zagan, who was timid and afraid of death, after all, he had been operating in the Archipelago province for several generations. His troops were all local disciples of the Archipelago province. After they died in battle, they would at least collect their bodies and let spellcasters cremate them. Some of the Khedives who were in charge of overseas enclaves had only been operating in their own territory for a generation. Among their soldiers, there were even duty warriors, slave warriors, like the Japanese. These Khedives also had advisors who, like Zagan, felt that the situation was strange. After the battle, they hurriedly set off. As for the bodies of the slave warriors who died in the attack, they simply left them to rot in the wilderness. As for whether this would cause a plague, these Khedives did not care. After all, this was the territory of Medich under the jurisdiction of Pharaoh, not the overseas enclaves they were in charge of. However, they did not know that after they hurriedly set off. Soon, some Gnoll sorcerers and priests in robes appeared on the battlefield full of corpses. They looked at the corpses as if they were looking at some treasures. And these fellows were bound to be accompanied by muscular but pale abyssal ghouls. The Gnoll spellcasters commanded the abyss ghouls to collect the corpses on the battlefield and pile them up into a strange tower of flesh and blood. As for whether the ghouls would steal during the process of piling up, they simply turned a blind eye. Anyway, they knew that these towers of flesh and blood needed the body parts of the ghouls to be successfully activated. Chapter 9:14. I haven't seen it for many years. It's delicious. Dalt Hyena, who was in charge of piling up the tower of flesh, opened his mouth wide. His scarlet tongue drooped down, dripping with saliva. As a Gnoll sorcerer, the delicious food that could make him crave was naturally not just the flesh. In fact, what he really coveted was the evil energy born from the tower of flesh. After the secret processing passed down by the Gnoll god Yinagu, the broken corpses that died in battle would produce a wonderful black magic reaction. To some of the Tana, Reed demons, this flesh was simply a delicacy. Although they did not need to eat, the demons in the lower realm could not resist the desire to devour flesh. Dalt Hyena licked his lips. Now is not the time to be greedy, he warned himself. Thinking of the cruel punishment Yinagu gave to those who could not complete the task, he could not help but tremble. These abyssal ghouls have had a good meal, but you'll be in for it later. Thinking of this, Dalt Hyena took out a brown mud ball from his trouser pocket. Take it, he shouted to an abyss ghoul who was busy piling up the tower of flesh while chewing the materials casually, then threw the mud ball to the ghoul. Eat this pill. This is Yeenagu's order. The abyss ghoul did not doubt him and swallowed the mud ball in one gulp. However, not long after, his wrinkled white body began to tremble involuntarily. Yellowish-brown smoke spewed out from the abyss ghoul's nostrils, ears, and pores. In the end, the half-demonized, undead creature couldn't take it anymore. Like a mortal who had eaten something bad, it spat out a mouthful of yellow soup and splashed it all over the tower of flesh. A stench that was 100 times more intense than fermented herring, pickled puffin, and other top-grade dark element food instantly soared into the sky. Even if one were to tightly cover their nose and not breathe, one could tell from the rising pillar of air just how evil this thing was. Dalter Greatooth did the same and fed all the abyss ghouls who were in charge of building the tower of flesh a mudball. Very soon, a stinky pillar of air was rising above every tower of flesh and blood, which gradually connected into the most disgusting clouds. Previously, some greedy crows and vultures had landed on the tower to peck at the flesh and blood, and some other birds and insects had passed by. Now, these unlucky fellows had all fallen to the ground in a daze after being hit by the yellow smoke. He wasn't sure if he had been poisoned to death or suffocated to death by the stench. Since the gnolls had a very sensitive sense of smell, Dalt Scorpion had already run far away. Only the abyss ghouls, who were not afraid of the stench, were left in the vicinity of the tower forest. However, these guys had spat out the things that had accumulated in their bodies. Although they felt a little better now, their bodies were completely powerless. They could only sit on the ground and struggle at death's door, using the breath of the abyss ghouls' abdominal fluids to communicate with the abyss, and then using the rotten aura of the tower of flesh and blood to attract them. No matter how cunning those rocks are, they will be attracted by Yeenagu's trick and fight for their lives in front of the two armies, the gnoll sorcerer thought to himself. At some point, he had a skull shining with a green light in his hand. Obviously, he had made preparations in advance. It was no wonder that he was so careful. Not long after the yellow smoke condensed into a cloud, a shrill and sharp cry of a vulture exploded in the air, causing Dalter Greatooth to shiver. In the yellow smoke cloud, a figure appeared. A yellowish-green spore cloud and a feathered tail surrounded the twisted, half-human, half-vulture creature. Its slender and strong limbs were covered with short gray feathers. Its long neck had a vulture's head and a pair of huge wings on its back. This was a Vrak, also known as a vulture. It was a true demon of the Tower of Flesh and Blood. As the defenders of blasphemy in the abyss, Vraks embodied all the anger, hatred, and violence of this despicable kingdom. They were as greedy, strange, and opportunistic as scavengers. These demons could derive pleasure from bleeding, and they enjoyed the sound and feeling of organs being torn out of living things. As a tower of flesh, Vraks were undoubtedly much stronger than gnolls. A typical vulture stood 8 feet tall and weighed 400 pounds. This type of tower of flesh was generally built from evil souls full of hatred and anger, especially those professional criminals, mercenaries, or assassins. After death, they were particularly easy to fall into the abyss and become Vraks. The Vraks, who had just stepped into the Ash world, adapted for a long time and finally adjusted to the same frequency as this plane. Their minds were no longer muddled, and they became much clearer. Their vulture-like heads shook a little, and they sniffed with their nostrils and smelled the stench of yellow smoke. However, the Tower of Flesh and Blood did not find the stench unpleasant at all. Instead, the stench aroused their desire to eat. Seeing the Tower of Flesh and Blood below, the demon swooped down from the sky and plunged into it to eat. As it ate, the flesh and blood made it difficult to eat. After all, no matter how good the Tower of Flesh and Blood tasted, it was just a pile of dead things. The Vrak pulled out its blood-stained head and looked around. There were many weak abyss ghouls lying on the ground. Ghouls. Seems like they're still lacking. Thinking of this, he raised his head and looked into the distance. He immediately saw Dalter Grizzly's figure. The Vrock's long, barbed tongue darted out, and saliva flowed down the corner of its mouth. Eating living things, even if they had the smell of the abyss, was more attractive to it than eating dead things. You're the one asking for it. Seeing the demon's greedy gaze, Dalt Gnarled didn't panic. He raised the skull in his hand and loudly chanted an incantation in the Knoll language. A shadow immediately shot out from the green skull, crossing a distance of 100 steps and entering the body of the Vrock. The Vrock's mind immediately went berserk, but its body was controlled by Yennegu's secret technique and could not move. It didn't take long for more Vrock to respond to the summons. They had also devoured a tower of flesh and blood, and had set their sights on Dalt Tusk. They were then subdued by the Knoll sorcerer with a secret spell. When all the towers of flesh and blood disappeared, the yellow smoke also disappeared. More than 100 Vrocks were frozen in place. The skull in Dalt Scrawny's hand was cracked. Clearly, it had been used to its limit. Seeing this, the Knoll sorcerer calmed himself down and threw the magic tool on the ground, shattering it into pieces. In an instant, all the Vrocks regained their ability to move. They instinctively wanted to skin Dalt Scrawny alive. However, the cracking sound of the skull was like a signal. The demons that were affected by Yennegu's secret technique began to attack and devour each other. In the end, only 3 Vrocks that had eaten dozens of their own kind remained. It's done. The Knoll sorcerer Dalt Sawtooth finally calmed down when he saw the 3 Vloes with the same green fluorescence as the skull from before. He had completed the mission given by God. Fortunately, he did not fall into the Vrock's mouth. Chapter 9:15. Dalter Greytooth was glad. When he returned to the Knoll camp outside Bite City, he found that about 30 to 40% of the spellcasters who received the same task as him, which was to set up the Tower of Flesh and Blood to attract the Vrock from the abyss. In other words, only 6 or 7 of the 10 spellcasters who went out came back. There was no doubt that the fate of the remaining fellows was naturally to become food for the vulture-like Tana lead demons. Therefore, Dalta was lucky. He successfully brought back 3 giant vulture demons. By devouring their own kind, the surviving Vrock had been strengthened to a considerable extent. If they could return to the abyss, they might have a chance to compete for the title of Lesser Demon Lord in the future. Of course, the premise was that they could successfully return alive. However, Dalter Greytooth felt that it was impossible. Since those vulture demons had been controlled by Emperor Yennegu's secret technique, in the following battle, they were basically used as much as they could as long as they did not die. After a few operations, they would be completely destroyed. They were nothing more than some high-level cannon fodder. A lot of them will be killed during the night attack, Dalter Greytooth thought, but it's all worth it. The clever Knoll sorcerer had already thought of the scene when the Knolls and ghouls broke into Bite City, a city with a population of nearly 1 million. Thinking of the endless flesh and blood he could enjoy, he couldn't help but salivate. In the morning, using the throne as a chariot to break into the city was a great success. But the army that was supposed to break into the city was pushed back by the tenacious and well-equipped defenders of Bite City. Yennegu was naturally unwilling to give up. While ordering the soldiers to retreat, he also came up with a plan for the night attack. The giant vulture demons were the key part of the plan. As time went by, in just half a day, there were some new changes in Bite City. The officers in charge of guarding the city ordered people to build temporary barriers with sharp wooden stakes, and then the defenders piled up whatever they could get on this foundation. Stones, wood, firewood, bushes, and a lot of soil were transported to seal the gap in the city wall. In order to prevent the temporary wooden barrier from being burned down by the fireball spell cast by the spellcasters of the demon army, the outer surface of the wooden barrier was covered with animal skins. After the temporary barrier reached a certain height, the defenders placed some wooden barrels filled with soil at intervals on top of the barrier to protect the defenders from the javelins thrown by the gnolls. Some black-robed wizard from the Obsidian Council had also joined in. Since Pharaoh and Mako had opened their treasure trove, these aristocratic spellcasters had obtained an inexhaustible supply of obsidian magic beads. Every time a section of the wall was built with mud, they would use mud to stone on it, turning it into a hard stone wall. However, in order to repair the city walls, even with the assistance of spellcasters, a large amount of manpower was needed. In addition to the garrisons, Pharaoh and Mako also recruited male and female slaves from the major merchants and dignitaries of Bite City to carry wood, stones, and soil all day long, trying to repair the broken fortifications. This kind of continuous physical labor made more and more tired slaves even more tired. Although the newly built city wall had blocked the gap that was broken in the morning, the foundation of this area was not solid, so they could not place too many heavy cannons to defend the city. On this section of the city wall, which was hundreds of yards long, only one heavy cannon was placed. The rest were just small caliber cannons that served as auxiliary support. The soldiers who guarded the city affectionately called them big bears with cubs. Besieging a city required the sacrifice of people, enthusiasm for the siege, and expectation of what would happen after the city was breached. However, there was a time limit to the willpower to fill the ditch with trampled corpses. This was the basic war knowledge that all military officers knew. They believed that even the demons from the bottomless abyss could not have unlimited enthusiasm. Those guys were now competing with the Medici Empire. All the garrisons believed that the final victory would belong to them. When several Khedive arrived with reinforcements in person, this belief became more and more firm. They were not the only ones who could defend Bite City. All the forces of the Medici Empire were already on their way to help Bite City. So long as they persisted until the end and the city wasn't breached, then those evil spirits that dared to invade this magnificent city would be like grains that were sent into a millstone, and they would be crushed into pieces by strands of force. Walking on the empty streets and alleys, Namin, who was hiding himself, carefully avoided the patrolling soldiers. Even the contract demons who were good at hiding in the material plane had to be very careful at this moment, because there were many black-robed sorcerers among the soldiers. Pharaoh had issued a strict order. The more rampant the demons were outside the city, the more they could not start a fire in the city. No matter what kind of trouble they were, as long as they were caught, they had to be eliminated directly to avoid future troubles. Even many small bandit gangs that usually mingled in the marketplace were implicated by the current situation. Their lairs were easily found by the soldiers. The protection umbrella that they used to worship had now become their death warrant, revealing all their details. Those who surrendered were locked up in prison. Those who dared to resist were killed by countless swords and arrows. Countless families were destroyed. I just lit the fuse with the fake coins. Now I have to find a powder keg for them, Namin thought to himself as he skimmed across the street. However, he didn't need any special plan. The spies of the Scale of Perpetual Order had been operating in Bite City for many years. They just needed to thread the needle according to the information they got. In particular, now that 6 or 7 Khedives had led their soldiers into the city, it was impossible to hide the fact that their subordinates had made fake coins for long. Now, the Khedives, including Zagan and Khalil, had all sent their most capable subordinates to quickly clean up the mess. They also had many businesses in Bite City, and every shop had a large amount of cash stored in it. At this moment, these Khedives were all busy transferring the wealth to their own barracks. They wanted to take it all away after defeating the demons outside the city. At that time, even if Pharaoh held them accountable, they would at most lose some branches and give up some irrelevant businesses. They wouldn't really suffer any serious losses. Namin had already found a warehouse. This was one of Zagan's important businesses in Bite City. On the surface, it was a business of storing goods, but in private, it was a business of lending. Out of caution, all the silver coins earned by this warehouse were stored in a special warehouse, and not in any collection office or bank in the city. Now, the Khedives sent by Zagan had put all the wealth they had stored into boxes and barrels in the name of purchasing war supplies. They wanted to immediately transport it to Zagan's barracks. Chapter 9:16. Strong and muscular horses pulled the carriages with wide tails, which rolled together and made a rustling noise. The soldiers sent by Zagankidive escorted the carriages as they moved slowly on the flagstone road of Bite City. They wanted to move faster, but there were too many goods piled up on the carriages. All of a sudden, there was a loud pah sound coming from the convoy. The wheel of a carriage ran over a stone protruding from the ground, and the wheel hub instantly shattered into pieces. Large baskets of grain and vegetables poured down from the top of the carriage, followed by some beer barrels that rolled down and hit the ground with a gully-loo sound. "Hurry up and pack up." Seeing this scene, the squad leader in charge of leading the team was furious. He ordered his soldiers in the dialect of the Archipelago province. On the opposite side of the road, a group of garrison troops happened to pass by. Hearing the dialect that did not belong to Bite City, the captain of the garrison troops immediately looked over. "It's them." The captain saw the flag inserted on the carriage and recognized the soldiers wearing armor that was different from that of the garrison troops of Bite City. They were Zagankidive's subordinates. He glanced at the goods that fell from the overturned carriage. The red ones were carrots, the yellow ones were ratchet rice, the green ones were vegetables, and the white ones were silver cats. Crowd control, the envy of the miser. Hiding in the corner of the street, he muttered something. His right thumb and little finger gently touched each other. Then, he casually cast an enchantment spell on most of the garrison soldiers, including the captain. This was a spell that contract demons were good at. Its function was very simple: to turn people into misers in an instant, making them uncontrollably greedy for certain specific treasures around them. Under the influence of the spell, the captain of the garrison troops breathed heavily, even though he did not want to be meddlesome. Similar heavy breaths came from the mouths and noses of his subordinates. "There are so many carriages. How many silver cats are there in them?" The captain's eyes could not contain anything else. He immediately shouted, "Stand aside. We have a routine inspection." Hearing this order, his subordinates pulled out the weapons in their hands and ran out one by one. They surrounded the men sent by Zagankidive, and no matter how much the squad leader tried to persuade them, he insisted on opening the carriage and inspecting it. First, it was a verbal conflict. Then it was punches and kicks. Finally, both sides began to use their weapons to hack at each other. "Kill these bandits and go back to the camp to receive your reward." This was the slogan of the squad leader sent by Zagankidive. The captain of the garrison troops didn't back down either. "Kill these thieves, count their silver, goods, and divide them equally." In the surrounding houses, although there were some brave people who pushed open their windows to secretly watch, they immediately knew that something was wrong when they heard the sounds of flintlocks and crossbow bolts. Not only did he hurriedly close the door, he even found some heavy objects to block the doors and windows. After all, the weapons in the hands of the two sides who were fighting were not something that ordinary bandits could possess. Looking at the armor on their bodies, anyone could guess that they were regular soldiers who were risking their lives to fight. There were demons outside Bite City, and the soldiers in the city had internal strife. This was definitely not a good thing. Some of the natives who had stayed in Bite City for a long time even hurriedly packed up their belongings and clothes. When the fighting outside was over, they immediately ran to the houses of their relatives to seek refuge. In any case, those big houses had high walls and many people. Their relatives huddled together in a group, which was much safer than those from small families. Ignoring the chaos here, the instigator of all this, Contract Megan, cast the jealousy of the miser and immediately fled. He followed the locations given by the spies of the Scales of Eternity Merchant Guild and visited the various caravans that were transporting the wealth of the Khedive. He looked for an opportunity to encounter the patrols of the garrison forces and presented them all as they were. Of course, the soldiers sent by different Khedive encountered different patrols of the garrison troops, so the result of the fighting was not the same. For example, Zagankidive only sent a few squads. Although his subordinates were good at fighting, they were not as many as the patrols. Soon, they were all killed, and the goods were not protected. Some Khedive sent a team of 100 soldiers to escort the goods. The number of soldiers was greater than the number of patrols, so the patrols were forced to retreat. However, the former was not so bad, but the latter was a big problem. Even though the captain of the heavily injured patrols was affected by the jealousy of the miser, he still recovered from the bloody fight. Seeing a large number of his subordinates die tragically, he immediately used magic to call for backup without any hesitation. The garrison troops in Bite City had been established for more than 100 years. Many officers and soldiers were relatives. In addition, the city was now under the attack of demons, so it was in the highest state of combat readiness. No matter who it was, no matter what the reason was, daring to show their weapons to the real garrison troops of Bite City at this time was the biggest taboo of taboo. As the chaos continued, not only the garrison troops were shocked, but even the Imperial Guards who were directly under the command of Pharaoh also sent out troops to suppress the situation. Some of the soldiers even followed their fleeing targets to the new camps that Khedive had set up not long after they entered the city. If it weren't for the fact that the officers still had some rationality, these arrogant soldiers who were already enraged by the killing would have already started preparing to launch an attack on those camps. After all, Bite City was not short of any weapons and equipment. Not only were there cannons on the city walls, but there were also enough offensive cannons in the Imperial Guards camps that could destroy a city. Khedive, who had come to Bite City for support, according to Meteka's law, had only brought about 1,000 soldiers with him. Their heavy weapons were no match for the Imperial Guards and garrisons of Bite City. As long as the Imperial Guards launched an attack on their camps, it would be razed to the ground in less than an hourglass. Oh no, oh no. Hearing his subordinates report that his camp had been surrounded by 2,000 soldiers of the Imperial Guards, Zagan's face suddenly turned pale. Even the pickled herring, which was regarded as a delicacy in the past, was swept off the table by him. Now, he had already begun to suspect that the reason why the Pharaoh Marco had summoned him and the other Khedive back during the invasion of the demons was to trick them into entering the city and catch the fish in the barrel. Chapter 9:17. When the farce happened, Pharaoh, who was wearing an eye-catching dark blue crown, rode his horse to inspect the defense camp behind the city wall under the protection of the brave warriors. The herald also followed him, loudly announcing that as long as they held on for a few days, the counterattack would be launched. The news shouted out in the sea of tents ignited the soldiers' passion. As you know, there are still many vacant positions in the Medici Empire. The best positions will be awarded to the bravest soldiers in the fight against the demons. I will give him the glory he deserves and repay him with a high position. I will make him extremely happy in our generation. But if I were to see someone hiding in a tent or slacking off while fighting on the city walls, I swear on the sword in my hand and in the name of the hero king's descendant that I will make him die in excruciating pain. Marco's words reached every corner of the camp through the mouths of the messengers one after another. This was a military practice since ancient times in the Medici Empire. Before the war, the highest commander, now Pharaoh, before it was the Grand Vader, would use a clear hierarchy of rewards and a vague but cruel punishment system to motivate the entire army. In other words, now that dusk was approaching, Pharaoh and Mako were already certain that the Abyss army that was defeated during the day on the city wall would launch a sneak attack. Guessing this point was not only a consideration of military strategy, but also the contribution of the Obsidian Council mages who served beside him. They had already used prophecy magic to divine the result. However, what made Mako feel a little unprepared was that before the demon army launched the night attack, the city had already begun to use their weapons. Even if he originally wanted to punish the unruly Khedive, he would not be stupid enough to make a move at this time. Wouldn't it be better to wait until the army of the Abyss was defeated and use the momentum of the victory to subdue them? At that time, wouldn't he be able to do whatever he wanted? But the situation now was not up to him. According to the information sent by the scouts, Khedive's soldiers were bold enough to use their weapons against the garrison. The reason for this might be that the patrols were greedy when they saw that Khedive had sent people to escort a large number of silver cats. But daring to kill the garrison in Bite City was not only a slap to Pharaoh's face, but also a challenge to the authority of the empire. "Let those idiots come see me." After hearing the news, Mako's face turned pale. He almost roared to the herald. "I only gave them 1/3 of an hourglass. After this time, they don't have to come again. Also, inform the black-robed mages of the Obsidian Council to go to those idiots' camp and cast the dimensional anchor spell." With Pharaoh's order, Bite City, Bite City, Bite City became livelier. Being besieged did not cause much panic in the city. Most people felt that it would only take a few days for the city to return to normal. They would do business as usual, go to work as usual, eat and drink as usual, and go to the bazaar to buy all kinds of consumer goods from the entire Ash world. However, as the news of the counterfeiting of silver cats began to spread more and more bizarre, as the garrison, the Imperial Guards, and the Khedive's army began to confront each other, the people gradually began to panic. Chaos is breeding and spreading here. In the night, sitting on a throne that had just been shaped by a Knoll spellcaster, Inigo looked up at the bright moon, then looked at the swaying lights in the opposite city, and listened to the occasional screams. It's time to let those humans taste horror again. He twisted his neck and let out a shrill howl. When thousands of Knolls heard this sound, they immediately raised their necks and responded with all kinds of howls. Unlike the human army, who had to hold lights when marching at night, every Knoll's eyes lit up with a green light as they rushed forward in the night. In several underground caves dug during the day, the Abyss ghouls tirelessly turned the corpses collected from outside the city into ordinary ghouls with weaker strength. They did not need these weak ghouls to fight. Instead, they just needed to take advantage of their characteristics of not being afraid of fatigue and use their claws to dig tunnels directly into the city. The powerful Abyss ghouls were urging them. As long as anyone dared to slack off, the ghoul would immediately be swallowed up by the Abyss ghouls. Because the foundation of Bite City was hard rock, the garrison did not think that the demon army would use earthwork to fight, just like the practice of hundreds of years before. But when ghouls began to emerge from the tunnels under the walls, and several sections of the city wall suddenly collapsed, the garrison had to immediately face this problem. There were only two ways to deal with this kind of earthwork. One was to take precautions in advance, and the other was to go deep into the tunnels and fight back. The first way was out of the question, so the garrison of Bite City could only use the second way. Relying on the advantage of weapons and equipment, they blocked the ghouls back into the tunnels. As for going deep into the tunnels, with the help of the Obsidian Council, the soldiers did not need to jump into the dark underground tunnels with their flesh and blood to court death. A large number of violent fire and earth elemental creatures were summoned by the mages to fill the tunnels and defend against the enemy. Screech. But when most of the people's attention was focused on how to deal with the army of Knolls outside the city and the terrible undead creatures that suddenly emerged from underground, ominous screeches suddenly came from above their heads. More than 30 giant vulture demons, whose wingspans were more than 20 yards long and almost as large as a megalosaurus, swooped down from the sky while howling. They held each other tightly with their seemingly weak but actually strong arms. As they swooped down, they kept rotating as if they were dancing in the air. With each rotation, the thick green smoke that shrouded them became darker, and the area covered by the smoke expanded a little. When they swooped down to a height of hundreds of meters, the area covered by the thick smoke was enough to drown a market in Bite City. Not good. It's the dance of destruction of the Vrock demons. Although giant vulture demons were rare, some black-robed mages who were proficient in demonology still recognized the incomplete evolution of the Vrock demons. They immediately used magic to send a warning. The smoke is made of spores that can't be seen with the naked eye. Who knows what will happen if you get infected? The spores emitted by the dance of destruction of ordinary Vrock demons could cause paralysis. Since giant vulture demons were rarer, no one knew what the spores could do. But there was no need to think about it. No matter what, it was best not to be tainted. Chapter 9:18. The dark spore cloud, like a piece of creepy dark green silk, fell from the sky and covered a market in Bite City. Of course, the black-robed sorcerers of the Obsidian Council couldn't just sit by and watch. Together, they consumed the obsidian magic beads and cast the burning cloud spell on a large scale, trying to destroy the spore cloud in advance. The so-called burning cloud spell was actually very similar to the air frying pot. The casting material was also the light black oil that had been purified by alchemy. More than a dozen black-robed sorcerers chanted the spell at the same time, turning the light black oil into tiny droplets that rose into the air and then ignited them at the same time. In a split second, the flame wrapped the oil droplets and surged along with the airflow, burning everything within the range of the spell. Even the slightest contact with the dense green spore cloud would be burned to a crisp by the flames. From the perspective of others, the black-robed sorcerers seemed to have summoned a ferocious beast made of fire, which bit off a large piece of the spore cloud. However, when everyone thought that the dance of destruction summoned by the giant vulture was about to end, the enhanced Vrock that had been strengthened by the secret spell created a new trouble. After the dance, the giant vulture opened their tightly clenched arms. A gust of wind gushed out from the center where the giant vulture gathered, spreading the spore cloud thinner and wider than the maximum range that the burning cloud spell could cover. No, the spore cloud that fell to the ground covered almost half of Bite City. In addition to the black-robed and gray-robed sorcerers of the Obsidian Council, there were also spellcasters and the rich merchants and noble families living in the city. They had been observing the situation, but when they saw the spore cloud falling on their territory, they couldn't just stand by and watch. In an instant, all kinds of magic waves spread out in Bite City. Some people were casting spells to ward off diseases. Some people were casting spells to protect themselves from evil. Some people were summoning fire elemental creatures or water elemental creatures to clean up the spores in their houses. Some people even started to summon teleportation portals, preparing to flee with their families. Chaotic magic waves, mixed magic lights, and all kinds of chaos and evilness began to spread in the city. The spellcasters didn't expect that their own spells would strengthen the power of the chaotic spores spread by the giant vulture. The kind-hearted people began to feel sluggish. The businessmen who were good at self-preservation became irritable, and the guys who had done many evil deeds couldn't hold back their desire to do evil. Not long after the spore cloud landed, a series of riots broke out in the dungeons of Bite City. No matter where the chaos and evilness happened in the multiverse, the abyss would eventually find it. Plus, the giant vulture, the abysses is the abysses is the abysses is of the abysses is abysses. A Bite cities of the city had of the city of the abyss of the city of the abyss of us of the of, and of Bite, s's and ofs of which was this of its. In order to promote the corruption of Bite City, the bottomless abyss gave a helping hand to the abyss. In addition, as the chaos and evilness spread, the abyss sent many of its people to Bite City. From the corpses of the dead livestock and poor people, a group of original demons was born. These humanoid monsters were only 3 feet tall, and their swollen bodies stank of rotten fat. Maggots wriggled in the wounds of their grayish-white flesh. Their thin, membrane-like white eyes looked muddled, making people feel pity for them. However, their long claws and jagged teeth exposed their ferocious and cruel temperament. The original demons often smiled foolishly, looking very pitiful. They were the lowest of the low demons. They were the weak Tana, reed demons formed directly from the souls of evil creatures sent to the abyss. Even Dretch could enslave them. They were even less valuable than demon worms. They were a rare kind of demons with almost no intelligence. They were easily driven by wildness and anger. They obeyed the orders of any demons stronger than them, including charging blindly without regard for danger. However, the original demons were born slow and stupid and often did not play any role. They were the real, motley crew of the abyss. Their only contribution was to show the abyss's abhorrence of those evil but despicable souls. Generally speaking, the original demons could not leave the abyss or evolve into higher-level demons. It required a lot of luck, because they were too weak and easy to kill, and they only emitted a cloud of acid mist after death. The Bat-Devil was immune to acid damage. Therefore, they were not even qualified to be cannon fodder on the bloody battlefield. For these origin fiends, being able to be sent to a material plane by the Abyss was undoubtedly a rare opportunity in their mediocre lives. Although the Abyss could send a few six-armed snake demons, Glabrizu, or a powerful Baylor, based on the total amount of chaos and evilness emitted from Bite City, it was not impossible. However, those Tanarite demons were only tyrannical individuals. They were easily targeted and killed by the strong people in the city, so the damage caused was limited. The shrewd Abyss consciousness did the opposite and simply sent a lot of original demons that were like trash in the Abyss. If one cast a wide net, one could always catch a big fish. With the special care of the Abyss consciousness, as soon as those original demons appeared in the Ashen world, they immediately began to attack the mortals they could see. They were not afraid of death at all, because death was more like a relief to them. Some original demons had used up their good luck and fell into the homes of rich families, where they encountered warriors and spellcasters and were quickly killed. And some still had luck. They killed more lives and even began to show signs of evolving into higher-level demons. For example, an original demon born in the depths of a prison actually bit to death more than a dozen heinous criminals in the same cell. Bathed in blood and minced meat, this original demon evolved into a higher-level monstrous demon in a few breaths. He became a somewhat hunchbacked demon who was about twice the height of the original demon form, 6 feet. Although his muscles were slightly slender, he was actually much taller and stronger than most mortals. The reason why he was called a monstrous demon was that his body was somewhat asymmetrical and distorted. One arm was thick and one leg was thin, and one leg was thick and one leg was thin. On his skin covered with green and purple stripes, there were 1 or 2 tufts of uncomfortable-looking hard hair every few feet. On his slender neck, there was a long head that looked like a squash and a pair of small red eyes filled with hatred. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.